You won't believe what happened that night. It was a quiet evening in the outskirts of North Carolina, where the dim lights of a lone gas station flickered in the night. Captain Lila Hayes eased her car into the parking lot, glancing at the clock. It was close to midnight, and she still had hours of driving ahead before she'd finally make it home. Tonight wasn't just any night. It was the first time in months she'd get to see her family. As her car came to a stop by the gas pump, Lila stepped out. Her dusty combat boots, scuffed and worn, were a reminder of the months she'd spent deployed in Afghanistan. She felt a mix of comfort and strangeness in this place she once called home. But tonight, the quiet would be shattered. As she began filling her tank, 3 men approached from a distance. Dressed in leather jackets, tattoos snaking down their arms, and cold, calculating eyes, these bikers weren't here for gas. Their leader, a burly guy with a sneer named Bear, let out a whistle as they got closer, eyeing her with a smug grin. Well, look at this. A lady soldier, huh? Bear mocked, his voice dripping with disdain as his buddies chuckled beside him. Lila kept her calm, her sharp gaze observing every move they made. Her instincts, honed from years in the military, sensed their intentions before they even spoke. "Let me fill up and be on my way," she said firmly, her tone strong but measured. She knew how to face down threats without showing fear. But Bear wasn't about to back down. He took another step closer, smirking. "And who do you think you are? Just another soldier? What did this country even leave you with besides that old uniform?" His words stung, cutting into her pride, but Lila forced herself to stay composed. She'd faced worse dangers overseas, and she wouldn't let anyone disrespect her here, not in her own country. "I've survived nights in Afghanistan scarier than this," she reminded herself, keeping her breathing steady as she prepared for things to escalate. Captain Lila Hayes is not one to back down easily, and these bikers are about to find that out. What happens next when her patience finally snaps? Stay tuned. This is one story you won't want to miss. You've never seen a standoff like this before. The hum of the gas station's fluorescent lights buzzed louder in the silence as Lila locked eyes with Bear. Her heart pounded, but her face remained calm, a skill she'd mastered through years of training. The other 2 bikers, Spike and Viper, flanked Bear, each trying to look more intimidating than the other. Their laughter echoed in the empty night, mocking and cold. Lila carefully unscrewed the gas cap, keeping her movements smooth and controlled. The only sign of her tension was the slight tightening of her jaw. These men might not have realized who they were dealing with, but she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of reacting. Her plan was simple: fill up her tank, drive away, and leave these guys to their games. But they had other ideas. "Well, soldier," Bear sneered, stepping even closer, "you think you're too good for us, huh? What's your story? Can't handle real life, so you hide behind that uniform?" Lila glanced at him, a flicker of contempt flashing across her face before she looked away. They didn't know her story, didn't know the nights she'd spent under fire, the people she'd lost, the sacrifices she'd made. "Look," she said, her tone steady, "I don't want any trouble. I've had enough of that to last a lifetime." She turned back to the pump, hoping her clear words would end this. But Spike moved closer, his hand drifting to something at his waist. Lila's eyes tracked the movement. Her mind noted the bulge beneath his jacket, likely a weapon. Her instinct screamed at her to stay sharp, to stay ready. She tightened her grip on the pump handle, calculating the angles, exit routes, and the best way to neutralize each one of them if they tried to make a move. As if sensing her calm resolve, Bear's expression twisted with a flicker of hesitation. "What's the matter?" he sneered. "Afraid of us?" Lila's gaze fixed on him, icy and unyielding. "Afraid of you?" She scoffed. "I've faced down things you wouldn't even understand." The air between them grew tense, a storm of hostility and fear brewing in the dim glow of the station lights. The bikers had no idea that their taunting could turn deadly in seconds if they made the wrong move. Then, the gas pump clicked off, signaling a full tank. Lila kept her movements steady as she replaced the nozzle, her eyes never leaving Bear. "I suggest you leave me be," she said, her voice calm but laced with a warning. "There's no need for this to go any further." But Bear only grinned wider, taking one more menacing step forward. Let's see if you're as tough as you look. Captain Lila Hayes has held her ground, but these bikers aren't backing off. How far will they push her before she's forced to defend herself? You won't believe what happens next. Don't go anywhere. If you think she's backing down, think again. The bikers closed in, each step pressing tighter against Lila's personal space. The gravel crunched beneath their boots, and the faint scent of beer and cigarette smoke wafted in the warm evening air. Lila's military training kicked in, a calm readiness settling over her. Every fiber of her being was tuned to the moment, calculating how she'd take down each man if it came to that. Spike, the tallest, leaned in first, a smirk spreading across his face. You think you're some kind of hero? Coming back here, strutting around in that uniform? She glanced up, eyes steady. I think I'm someone who just wants to fill up her tank and leave. I suggest you move along. Bear, the leader, let out a mocking laugh and turned to his crew. She's got guts. I'll give her that. But he stepped forward anyway, blocking her path to the car door. His hand rested on his belt, and his eyes glinted with something mean and dark. Lila gave a single, unflinching look in his direction. Her voice was calm, her words precise. I've faced tougher than you. Step aside before you do something you'll regret. Bear's confidence wavered for a split second, a flicker of doubt. But he doubled down, leaning forward and saying in a low growl, "Oh, I think I'll take my chances." Spike and Viper shifted, angling their bodies to close in from either side. They had no idea what they were getting into. Lila's mind was already mapping out her moves, the exact timing it would take to disarm and disable them, with minimal harm but maximum control. With the lightest movement, she squared her stance, ready for the fight they clearly wanted. Then, suddenly, headlights swept across the station as a truck pulled in. The bikers flinched and glanced around, momentarily distracted. The truck came to a stop, and a heavy-set man in a trucker's cap climbed out, oblivious to the tension in the air. "Evening," he called out, nodding at the group. "Looks like you folks are having quite the conversation." The bikers scowled, unwilling to act under someone else's gaze. Bear shot Lila a glare, his frustration palpable. "We'll be seeing you again, soldier," he said, the words dripping with menace. Lila watched as they backed off, one by one, grumbling and cursing as they returned to their bikes. She held her ground, expression unchanging, as they finally roared out of the gas station, their engines fading into the night. She released a breath, her fingers still tingling with the readiness to react. She gave the trucker a grateful nod, then climbed into her car, her mind replaying the encounter. Lila might have escaped for now, but Bear and his gang aren't done. What's coming next will push her to the edge. Don't miss what happens when they cross paths again. Stay tuned. They thought they could scare her. They were dead wrong. The moon had risen high in the night sky as Lila drove along the empty highway, her mind racing through the evening's events. She had handled worse encounters in foreign war zones, yet something about the bikers' menacing glances unsettled her. They hadn't just been looking for trouble. They wanted her to feel small, outnumbered, and cornered. But she was no stranger to intimidation tactics. Lila's phone chimed, snapping her back to the present. A message from her daughter, Ellie, popped up. "Mom, can't wait to see you. I miss you so much." Smiling, she typed a quick response, promising to be home soon. The warmth of Ellie's message chased away the remnants of tension lingering from the gas station encounter. Up ahead, the faint glow of headlights appeared in her rearview mirror, followed by the unmistakable rumble of motorcycle engines. Her jaw tightened as she recognized the bikes from earlier. Bear, Spike, and Viper were back, and they were tailing her. For a moment, she considered speeding up and losing them, but she knew the backroads too well. There wouldn't be any other cars for miles. If they wanted to push her, she'd have to confront them. Her military instincts told her she was more than prepared, but she also knew these men might not stop if they thought they had the upper hand. They rode up on either side of her car, engines revving as they pulled closer. Viper grinned, leaning close to her window as he sneered, "Thought you could just walk away? Not that easy, soldier." Bear's voice came booming from the other side. "Hope you're ready for a little fun tonight." Lila kept her hands steady on the wheel, a sense of calm determination settling over her. She knew if she showed fear, they'd take advantage. Instead, she rolled down her window slightly, her gaze hard and unyielding as she met Bear's eyes. "Careful what you wish for," she warned, her voice icy. Bear barked out a laugh. "Oh, we'll see about that." The bikers kept pace with her car, taunting her with shouts and gestures as they tried to throw her off. She maintained her focus, her mind racing through potential maneuvers, ready for anything. Suddenly, Bear jerked his bike, attempting to swerve into her lane, forcing her to swerve back. Lila's instincts kicked in. She downshifted and veered sharply, pressing on the gas to pull ahead. But Bear was relentless, following close behind, his headlights flooding her car. She could see his smug expression in her rearview mirror as he flashed his lights, a taunt she was unwilling to ignore. Then, without warning, she braked hard. Bear, caught off guard, had no time to react. His bike skidded, the tires screeching as he narrowly missed colliding with her car. Lila hit the gas again, pulling away as she watched his bike wobble in her rearview. Spike and Viper slowed, checking on Bear as he straightened his bike. Lila didn't wait around. She drove off into the night, her heart racing but steady, leaving the stunned bikers behind. They had made one thing clear. They weren't going to let her slip away easily, but they didn't know just how much fight she had left in her. The bikers have underestimated Lila once again. But how far will they go to make her pay? Keep reading to find out what she'll do when they push her too far. They made a grave mistake. Lila's pulse still raced as she sped through the winding roads, the sound of the engine humming beneath her like a steady drumbeat. The tension that had built up over the past few minutes slowly began to ease, but her mind was sharp. It wasn't over. Those men, Bear, Spike, and Viper, they weren't going to let this go. The encounter at the gas station had been one thing, but the way Bear had tried to force her off the road, that was personal. She checked the rearview mirror again, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of pursuit. Nothing. The road behind her was empty. For now. But that didn't mean she was safe. Lila took a deep breath, trying to clear her head. She needed to think. She had a few miles left to go, but the moment she turned onto the back road to her house, she'd be in a secluded area. If they were still following her, she would be alone, and that meant it would be her against them. As she approached the turnoff to her property, she slowed, the headlights casting long shadows across the trees that lined the dirt road. It was the perfect place to set a trap, and Lila had never been one to back down from a fight. She pulled into the long driveway and parked her car next to the old barn. The area was quiet, except for the distant hum of insects and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. She turned off the engine, sitting in the stillness for a moment, weighing her options. If Bear and his crew came this way, they'd think she was hiding, scared, or waiting for them to come to her. They'd be wrong. Lila slipped out of the car, her boots crunching on the gravel as she moved toward the barn. It wasn't just a place for storage, it was a fortress in disguise. Over the years, she'd reinforced the barn, adding hidden exits and tools for just this kind of scenario. She wasn't just going to be a sitting target. Her hand found the latch of the barn door, and with a quiet creak, it opened. Inside, her rifle was waiting. She had kept it in prime condition, just like her combat skills. She reached for it and checked the magazine. Full. She made her way to a small side window, crouching low as she scanned the surrounding area. And then, the sound of engines in the distance. First faint, but growing louder. They were coming. Lila's grip tightened around the rifle as she took position, her heart steady but alert. She knew how these men thought. They would come in with intimidation, trying to rattle her, make her show weakness. They wouldn't expect someone who had fought for her life, time and time again, with nothing but grit and willpower. The bikes roared closer, the headlights blinding in the night as they neared her property. Lila narrowed her eyes, watching carefully as they turned onto her driveway. She counted them, 2 bikes this time, Viper and Spike, with Bear nowhere in sight. They stopped just short of the barn, their engines cutting off with a roar. The 2 men dismounted, scanning the area, clearly unaware of her presence. "She's here somewhere," Viper muttered, his voice laced with malice. "That old soldier's probably hiding in there, thinking she's safe." Spike grinned, a twisted smirk on his face. We'll flush her out. Lila had heard enough. She was done playing their game. With a steady hand, she lifted the rifle, taking careful aim through the window. She didn't need to kill them, just send a message. She pulled the trigger, the sharp crack of the shot splitting the night air. It struck the ground just inches from Spike's foot. Both men jumped, instinctively reaching for their guns. Lila fired again, this time a warning shot near the tires of Viper's bike. The message was clear. She was not afraid. "Get out of here," she called through the window, her voice carrying the weight of a threat. "This is your only warning." Viper's eyes widened as he looked toward the barn. "Shit, she's got a gun." Spike's face twisted with rage. "She wants to play dirty, huh? Fine." He pulled his own weapon, but Lila was faster. Another shot rang out, this time hitting the ground near his feet, sending up a spray of dirt. He hesitated, his eyes darting between his bike and the barn. Viper growled, his hand hovering over the handle of his own gun. "You're making a big mistake, lady." Lila didn't flinch. "You've made all the mistakes tonight." For a moment, the two men just stood there, weighing their options. Lila could feel the tension in the air, the standoff stretching out like a coiled spring. And then, in one swift motion, both bikers turned, jumping back onto their bikes. With a roar of engines, they sped off down the driveway, disappearing into the night. Lila lowered the rifle, her breath steadying as the sounds of their retreat faded into silence. They were gone. For now. But she knew they'd be back. And next time, they wouldn't be so lucky. Lila has sent a message that no one can ignore. But will Bear come for revenge? Stay tuned to find out what happens when they push her even further. The calm before the storm, Lila sat in the dim light of the barn, her rifle resting across her knees. The sound of the engine had faded completely, leaving only the night's soft chorus of rustling leaves and distant animal calls. It was quiet now, almost too quiet, but that was the way she liked it, controlled, still, like the calm before a storm. The real fight hadn't even begun yet. She stood slowly, her body stiff from the tension of the standoff. The adrenaline was beginning to wear off, leaving a heavy exhaustion that tried to seep into her bones. But she couldn't afford to let her guard down. Not yet. Lila moved across the barn, checking the locks and securing the doors. She'd been through enough close calls in her life to know when to trust her instincts. And tonight, everything in her gut told her this wasn't over. The trouble with men like Bear and his crew was that they didn't know when to quit. They were bullies, pure and simple, and no matter how much force you used, they always came back for more. Sooner or later, they'd regroup, rearm, and try again. But Lila wasn't worried. If they thought they could intimidate her, they had another thing coming. She wasn't the same woman she had been 20 years ago. Time and war had hardened her, tempered her into someone who would take the fight to them, not wait for them to make the first move. As she made her way back toward the barn door, she noticed a faint flicker of movement through the crack in the wooden panels. She froze, every muscle in her body tensing, her heart rate spiking once again. She wasn't imagining it. Someone was on her property. Her first instinct was to grab her rifle again, but then she remembered the trap. She had set up a few surprises around the barn's perimeter, nothing too obvious, but enough to make anyone think twice before charging in. Lila moved quietly toward the back of the barn, slipping out of the side door and into the shadows. The only sound was the rustle of her boots on the gravel as she crouched low, waiting. She didn't have to wait long. A figure emerged from the tree-line, moving with the stealth of someone who knew the land. It was a man, tall and lean, dressed in dark clothes and moving with purpose. Lila's pulse quickened as she instinctively took a step back, reaching for the gun at her side. But before she could pull it, the man spoke. "Lila." Her breath caught in her throat. The voice was unmistakable. She stepped forward, her eyes narrowing in the moonlight. Nick. Nick Harper, her old friend, and a former army buddy. They hadn't seen each other in over 5 years, not since that mission in the Middle East that had gone wrong. The mission that had cost them both more than they'd ever expected to lose. He stood there, his face weathered and hardened by time, but the familiarity of his presence calmed her nerves just a little. "What the hell are you doing here?" Lila asked, lowering her rifle slightly, though still keeping it in hand. Nick raised his hands, a gesture of peace. I came to make sure you were okay. Heard you were in some trouble. Lila scoffed, her sharp gaze cutting through the night. Trouble? I'm not the one who's in trouble. But you wouldn't know that, would you? Nick's eyes darkened, but he didn't move. Lila, listen. I don't have time to explain everything, but we've got bigger problems. It's not just Bear and his boys. They're working for someone else, someone a lot worse. Lila's eyes narrowed further. What are you talking about? He stepped closer, lowering his voice. It's not just the local gangs anymore. There's a bigger player pulling the strings. I came to warn you. Lila's instincts flared again, this time with a cold rush of realization. She had suspected there was something more behind Bear's actions, something that didn't quite add up. But now, hearing it from Nick's lips, the pieces were starting to fall into place. The last thing I need is a lecture on how to handle things, she snapped, her patience wearing thin. I've been fighting for my life for years, Nick, and I'll keep doing it. Nick shook his head, his voice low. I'm not here to lecture. I'm here to help. They're planning something big, and if you don't move fast, they'll come for you, and everyone else around you. Lila's grip on the rifle tightened again, her mind racing. She didn't trust easily, not anymore. But Nick had been a brother to her back in the day. She couldn't afford to dismiss him outright, not when everything was starting to feel like it was slipping out of control. What are you suggesting? She asked, her voice quieter now, the edge of confrontation slipping away. Nick looked over his shoulder, as if checking for any sign of an ambush. We need to get ahead of them, find out who's behind this, and stop it before it gets worse. I've got some intel. We can work together. Lila studied him, weighing her options. She had no doubt that if she didn't take action soon, things were going to escalate quickly. But working with Nick, after all these years, meant putting her trust in someone again. And trust, after everything, was a hard thing to come by. Finally, she nodded. Okay, but this isn't your fight. You stay out of my way, and we'll get through this. Nick smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. Wouldn't dream of getting in your way, Lila. You've always known how to handle yourself. Lila turned, her gaze sweeping over the shadows of the barn. Then let's get to work. Lila and Nick may be allies for now, but trust doesn't come easily. Will their partnership survive the deadly forces closing in? Find out in the next chapter. The night stretched long, the tension in the air palpable. As Lila and Nick moved through the woods behind the barn, the sounds of the forest seemed to close in around them. Each step, each rustle in the underbrush, a reminder that danger was never far behind. Lila kept her senses sharp, her eyes scanning the shadows, the weight of the rifle in her hands offering a sense of calm in the midst of the chaos building around her. You've been keeping a lot of secrets, Nick, Lila said, breaking the silence as they trudged through the brush. What do you know about this bigger player you're talking about? Nick didn't respond immediately. Instead, he pushed aside a thick branch and motioned for Lila to follow him. His movements were careful, deliberate, as though every step could trigger something dangerous. When they were safely out of sight of the barn, he spoke in a low voice. It's not just some backwoods gang. Bear and his crew? They're just pawns, temporary muscle, disposable. The real operation is bigger, much bigger than we realized. There's a network, Lila. A whole network of arms deals, drug trade, and, Nick hesitated, his eyes flicking to the ground. Human trafficking. Lila's breath caught in her throat. She knew the world was full of darkness, but this was another level entirely. The idea of people being sold and traded like cattle hit her in the gut, but she couldn't afford to show weakness. Not now. Who's behind it? She asked, forcing her voice steady. Nick exhaled sharply, his hand running through his unkempt hair. I don't know, but they've got reach, long reach. It's not just local thugs. We're talking about organized crime, powerful people with money and influence, people who can make problems disappear. Lila clenched her jaw. The weight of the situation was sinking in now. This wasn't just about protecting her land anymore. It was about stopping something much larger, something that would take every ounce of strength and cunning she had left. I didn't come all the way out here for a vacation, Nick, she said, turning her gaze toward him. I'm in, but if we're going after this network, we do it on my terms. No more waiting. No more playing nice. Nick nodded. I wouldn't have it any other way. They continued walking, following a trail Lila hadn't seen before. A narrow path that wound through dense underbrush, barely wide enough for them to pass. It led deeper into the woods, and every step felt like they were entering enemy territory. As they approached a clearing, Lila could make out the faint glow of firelight in the distance. Her instincts screamed that they were getting close to something. Nick stopped abruptly, holding up his hand. We're close. Keep your head down. Lila moved instinctively, crouching low and moving into the shadows of a nearby tree. She peered through the thick foliage, her heart pounding in her chest. The clearing ahead was scattered with makeshift tents and trucks, some with the engines still running. She could see figures moving between them, men and women, roughly dressed, some of them armed, others looking more like workers than soldiers. What is this? Lila whispered, her eyes narrowing. Nick's voice was tight. It's one of their drop zones. They move people through here, transport them, like cattle. I've seen this kind of setup before. This is where they make the trade. Lila's stomach twisted. She could see now that there was a group of men unloading crates from one of the trucks, stacking them in a makeshift shelter. But it wasn't the crates that caught her attention. It was the people inside them. Slaves. They were being moved like livestock, their faces hollow, eyes dull with the hopelessness of their situation. Lila's anger flared, but she kept it under control. We can't just go in guns blazing, she said, her voice barely audible. We need to know who's calling the shots, who's making the deals. Nick nodded, his expression grim. I know. We need to get closer, find out who's in charge here. They waited, watching as the figures moved in and out of the camp, conducting their business with cold efficiency. Lila's mind raced, calculating their next move. This wasn't just about taking down a few bad guys. This was about taking down a whole operation, an intricate web that reached farther than they could have imagined. Suddenly, a loud engine roared to life, and a sleek black SUV pulled into the camp. The vehicle was well-maintained, out of place among the rusted trucks and dilapidated tents. The door opened, and a tall man stepped out, his posture rigid, exuding an air of authority that immediately caught Lila's attention. Who the hell is that? She whispered, her hand tightening around the rifle. Nick squinted through the trees, his eyes narrowing as he studied the man. That's Caleb Weston. He's the one behind all this. He's been working with Bear, but he's the one running the show. Trust me, you don't want to get on his bad side. Lila's pulse quickened. Caleb Weston. The name sounded familiar, but she couldn't place it. Whoever he was a problem. One that Lila knew would have to be dealt with if they were going to stop this operation. We need to take him down, she said, her voice low but firm. Now. Nick hesitated. It's risky, Lila. You can't just go after him. He's too powerful. Lila's eyes hardened. I didn't come all this way to back down. You with me or not? Nick gave a resigned sigh. I'm with you. Let's do this. They moved silently, weaving through the shadows of the trees, drawing closer to the heart of the camp. Lila's thoughts were laser-focused on one thing. Caleb Weston. This was no longer just a fight for survival. It was a fight for justice. Lila and Nick are closing in on their target, but Weston's reach is far and wide. The question remains. Will they be able to take him down, or will they become the hunted? Find out in the next chapter. Lila's breath came in shallow gasps as she crouched behind a large boulder at the edge of the clearing. The camp stretched out before her like a small fortress, the firelight casting long shadows across the makeshift tents and vehicles. Caleb Weston had just entered the camp, and she could feel the weight of his presence even from this distance. He was more than just a man. He was the symbol of everything that had to be destroyed. Nick crouched beside her, his eyes scanning the scene through a pair of binoculars. There's a guard at the entrance. He's got eyes on the whole camp. No way we're sneaking in that way. Lila gritted her teeth. We'll have to find another way in. Nick nodded, lowering the binoculars. His expression was one of quiet determination, but even he knew the risks of what they were about to do. Getting close to Weston was no small feat, but taking him down would send a message that the entire operation was at risk. We have two options, Nick said, his voice barely above a whisper. We can try to take out the guards and sneak in, or we can create a diversion. Something big enough to pull their attention away. Your call. Lila's mind raced. The first option was risky, too risky. A fight inside the camp would draw too much attention. But a diversion? That could work. The diversion, she said, her voice sharp and decisive. We need to hit them hard, distract them long enough to get to Weston. We take him, and we get out. Nick's eyes darkened with understanding. All right, we'll hit them fast. You ready? Lila nodded, checking her rifle one last time. It was loaded, and the weight felt reassuring against her shoulder. She didn't have time for second thoughts. This wasn't just a fight anymore. It was a war, and she would win. They moved swiftly through the woods, staying low and using the cover of darkness to hide their movements. The camp was still busy, the traders and workers going about their business, oblivious to the danger closing in on them. Lila's heart beat steadily, her senses heightened as they neared the edge of the camp. Where do you want to hit them? Nick asked. Lila scanned the area, her eyes darting between the guards and the nearest group of vehicles. The trucks were lined up near a small shack, the perfect target. A firecracker of an explosion would set the whole camp on edge. The guards would scramble. Weston would be vulnerable. Over by the trucks, she said. That's where we make our move. Nick gave a tight nod, pulling a small device from his jacket. I'll rig the charges. You keep watch. Lila crouched low, her back pressed against a tree as she kept her gaze fixed on the camp. Her fingers tightened around the grip of her rifle. Every second counted. She knew that when the explosion went off, all hell would break loose. But they had no choice. They couldn't afford to waste time. A few minutes passed, the air thick with tension. Then, the unmistakable sound of metal snapping and a small, muffled pop echoed through the night. The explosion rocked the camp, sending a plume of smoke and dirt into the air. Chaos erupted. Guards shouted, running in every direction. The traders and workers screamed and scattered, desperate to find cover. Lila's pulse raced as she locked eyes with Nick across the clearing. It was time. They moved fast, darting from shadow to shadow, slipping through the chaos without being seen. Lila's mind was laser-focused on one goal, Weston. She had to get to him before he disappeared. They made their way to the center of the camp, weaving through the mess of people and vehicles. Lila could hear the sound of boots on the ground behind her, the unmistakable noise of men moving to secure the perimeter. But there was no turning back now. They reached the shack where Weston had been standing just moments before. Nick motioned to the door, and Lila nodded. With a single swift movement, she kicked it open. Inside, Weston was standing with his back to them, speaking to one of the other men. He turned as the door burst open, his eyes narrowing in immediate recognition. The smile that had once been a mask of confidence quickly disappeared, replaced by a look of cold fury. Lila's rifle was aimed at him in an instant, the barrel steady in her hands. Nick was right behind her, his own weapon ready. Well, Weston said, his voice low and dangerous. Did you really think you could get this far? Lila didn't answer. She didn't have to. The gun in her hands spoke louder than words. We're taking you down, she said. This operation ends tonight. Weston's eyes flicked between Lila and Nick, calculating, his lips curling into a twisted smile. You think I'm the one you need to worry about? He motioned toward the back of the shack. I'm not the one who calls the shots here, but you're welcome to find out who is. Before Lila could respond, a loud crash echoed from behind them. A shadow emerged from the smoke and confusion, a massive figure stepping into the doorway. A man in a black combat uniform, his face obscured by a mask. Weston's smirk deepened as he looked past Lila, his voice cold and taunting. Meet your real problem. The figure lunged forward, and Lila's world exploded into chaos. She barely had time to react as the man came at them with a speed and strength she hadn't anticipated. In the same instant, she heard Nick's voice. Lila, move. But it was already too late. With the storm breaking, the fight for survival is on. But the real enemy is closer than they think. Can Lila and Nick escape the claws of those who pull the strings? Find out in the next chapter. Lila's heart raced as the masked figure lunged at her. Instinctively, she ducked, narrowly avoiding the heavy punch aimed at her face. The man was faster than she expected, his movements almost inhuman. A moment of hesitation cost her. He caught her by the arm and twisted, slamming her against the wall of the shack. The impact knocked the breath out of her, but she gritted her teeth and fought through the pain. Nick was already moving, shouting for her to stay down, but she didn't need to be told. The situation had escalated beyond anything they'd planned for. The figure wasn't just a guard or a soldier. He was something else entirely. Lila regained her footing just as the man moved toward her again. She drew her sidearm, aiming for his chest. He was fast, but she was faster. With a sharp, steady pull of the trigger, the gunshot rang out. The figure stumbled, a spray of red marking the spot where the bullet had hit, but he didn't go down. He barely flinched. "He's wearing body armor," Nick shouted, his own gun raised and ready. "Aim for the head." Lila didn't need further instructions. As the masked man lunged again, she ducked, twisting out of his reach. With a steady hand, she aimed her rifle at his head. The moment he stood up, his back turned for just a split second, she fired. The shot was clean. The man crumpled to the ground, his body still. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then, Weston's voice broke the silence. "Impressive," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "But you're too late." Lila whipped around, finding Weston standing by the door, his hands raised in mock surrender. Behind him, the shadows shifted, and another figure emerged, this one taller and more imposing. He was dressed in tactical gear, his features hidden by a black mask, but Lila could tell from the set of his shoulders and the cold look in his eyes that he was someone important. Lila's pulse quickened. "Who the hell are you?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as they met hers. A slow smile crept across his face. "Names don't matter right now," the man said, his voice low and dangerous. "What matters is that you've just made a very big mistake." Weston's lips curled into a smirk as he stepped aside, allowing the new figure to move closer. "This is your new problem, sweetheart. Meet Victor." Lila's grip tightened on her weapon. This was no ordinary mercenary or soldier. Victor had the aura of someone who ran things, not someone who took orders. And from the way Weston had introduced him, he wasn't just another henchman. He was the one pulling the strings. Victor's eyes glinted as he sized her up. "You really think you can take down this operation? You're out of your depth." Nick stepped closer, keeping his gun trained on Victor, but clearly uneasy. "We didn't come here for a fight. We came for you, Weston." Weston's eyes flicked to Nick, then back to Lila. He seemed unbothered, as if the threat wasn't even real. "You think I'm the head of this? You've got it all wrong." Lila's mind raced, trying to piece together the situation. Weston wasn't the one in charge, Victor was. But that raised even more questions. If Weston was only a pawn in a bigger game, then who was really running this operation? And how did they plan to stop it? "Tell me who's behind all this," Lila demanded, stepping forward, her eyes never leaving Victor. Victor chuckled darkly, his voice cold. "You think I'm going to tell you? You're not walking out of here alive." Suddenly, there was movement at the door of the shack. The sounds of boots hitting the dirt, low voices muttering, and the unmistakable click of weapons being readied. More men. They'd been surrounded. Nick cursed under his breath, but Lila didn't hesitate. She grabbed his arm, pulling him back into the corner of the shack. There was no way they were getting out of this without a fight. They needed a plan. Fast. "We're not getting out of here without a fight," she said, her voice low but steady. "We take out Weston, we take out Victor. We make our stand here." Nick gave her a grim nod. "We need to move fast, or we're dead." Victor seemed to enjoy their frustration, stepping closer as if savoring the moment. "You really think you can take me down? I've been running operations like this for years. You're nothing but ants beneath my boot." Weston, still standing to the side, folded his arms, looking pleased with the tension. "Let's see how long you last." Suddenly, the door to the shack was kicked open, and more men flooded in, their weapons raised. The odds were impossible, but Lila wasn't backing down. Not now. Without warning, She ducked behind the nearest crate and fired a quick burst toward the men coming in through the doorway. The gunfire rang out, chaos erupting around them. Nick joined her, returning fire, while Weston and Victor retreated deeper into the shack. Lila knew they didn't have much time. Every second spent in this position increased their chances of getting overwhelmed. She turned to Nick, her voice sharp. "We take Victor, and we get the hell out." Nick nodded once more, his jaw clenched. "On your mark." They counted to 3. Then, they moved. With enemies closing in, Lila and Nick are forced to make a final push for survival. But with Victor lurking in the shadows, the truth about who controls the operation is more dangerous than they ever imagined. The air in the shack was thick with gunpowder and tension. The sudden chaos had thrown everything into disarray, but Lila wasn't about to let it control her. She and Nick had taken cover behind an old crate near the back, using the few seconds of relative quiet to plan their next move. "On my count," Lila whispered, her voice sharp. "We push forward. Focus on Victor. Get him first. I'll cover you." Nick gave a quick nod. He was already scanning the room, his eyes calculating the positions of the men who had poured in. There were at least half a dozen, all armed and dangerous, spread out throughout the room, taking cover behind whatever they could find. But they were focused on their own positioning, not on Lila and Nick. Lila's breath came in shallow bursts, her heart pounding as she adjusted her grip on her rifle. Her mind raced with the weight of the situation. She'd been in tight spots before, but this felt different. There was something about Victor that made her gut churn, something that made him more than just another mercenary. 3, 2. Lila murmured under her breath, her finger hovering over the trigger. She had to time this right. One misstep, and it could all fall apart. The sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, cut through the noise. A figure stepped into view. Victor. He had positioned himself near the far end of the shack, just out of the immediate line of sight from where Lila and Nick were crouched. His black mask gleamed in the dim light, and his posture was confident, almost too calm for someone in the middle of a firefight. Lila didn't hesitate. She rose from her crouch, squeezing the trigger as she moved. The bullet flew through the air, striking a metal support beam just inches from Victor's head. He jerked back, his eyes darting toward her, but it was too late. Lila was already on the move, ducking behind another crate, shifting positions to avoid becoming an easy target. Nick fired in quick succession, his aim true, forcing the men on the opposite side of the room to dive for cover. They weren't giving them any room to breathe. Victor's eyes narrowed, his head turning slightly as he took in the situation. His voice, deep and measured, cut through the din of gunfire. "You think you can take me down, huh? You really think you're in control here?" Lila gritted her teeth, keeping her eyes trained on him. "I'm not here to take control. I'm here to end this." Her words hung in the air like a challenge. Victor took a step forward, his movements slow, deliberate. "This is bigger than you. Bigger than your little team. You have no idea what you're dealing with." Lila didn't flinch. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with." But even as she said the words, she knew something wasn't adding up. Victor didn't act like a mere foot soldier. His presence, the way he commanded attention, he was someone with power, someone with a plan that went beyond whatever Weston had been involved in. She had to know more, and she had to find out quickly before it was too late. A gunshot rang out, and Nick's voice came through the comms, tight with urgency. "Lila, move now." Lila didn't need to be told twice. She bolted toward the left side of the room, aiming her rifle at the men who had been closing in on their position. The sound of gunfire echoed around the shack, ricocheting off the walls in sharp bursts. She ducked behind a pillar, her heart pounding as she calculated her next move. Victor was still in the back, watching the chaos unfold with cold amusement. He wasn't panicking. That alone told Lila how dangerous he really was. This was no random mercenary. Victor was a man with a purpose, and that purpose wasn't to fight petty battles in backwater shacks. Come out, wherever you are." Victor's taunting voice rang out from the back of the room. "You're wasting your time." Lila's pulse quickened. She had to get to him, had to stop him. But how? The room was closing in on them, and Weston had disappeared into the shadows, likely using the confusion to slip away. There were too many variables at play here. Too many unknowns. Nick appeared at her side, his face set with determination. We need to hit him fast. I can get to his blind spot. Lila nodded. Cover me. Without another word, Nick moved, circling the room to get in position. Meanwhile, Lila kept her eyes locked on Victor, waiting for her chance. He was still standing in the open, too confident for his own good. Then, it came. The slight shift in his posture as he turned away for just a moment to look at the advancing soldiers. It was enough. Lila fired again, this time aiming for the shoulder. The shot struck true, sending Victor stumbling back, his mask cracking under the force of the impact. He snarled in pain but didn't fall. Is that all you've got? He spat, the blood from the wound dripping down his arm. You can't stop this. You're too small, too weak. But Lila wasn't listening anymore. She wasn't playing his game. She was playing hers. With a final burst of energy, she bolted forward, her feet pounding against the floor as she made a beeline for Victor. He saw her coming, and for the first time, his confident mask slipped, just a fraction. He reached for his sidearm, but before he could draw it, Lila closed the distance. She tackled him to the ground with the force of a freight train, her body crashing into his. The two of them rolled, each struggling for dominance, but Lila had the advantage of desperation. She could feel the cold steel of his gun in his hand, but she was faster. She wrenched it from his grip and tossed it aside, finally pinning him beneath her. Victor's breath came in sharp gasps, his eyes wide with shock. He had underestimated her, and now it was too late. Lila took a deep breath, steadying herself. She looked down at him, her eyes hard with resolve. You lose. Before he could react, she pulled the trigger. The shot echoed in the shack, the final note in a symphony of chaos. And then, silence. With Victor taken out, Lila and Nick are left to confront the aftermath of their mission. But even with the leader down, the truth about the operation and the people behind it is only beginning to unravel. The silence after the shot was deafening. It hung in the air, thick and suffocating. As Lila stayed on top of Victor's lifeless form, her hand still gripping the gun. She couldn't let go, not yet. Her breath came in ragged bursts, adrenaline coursing through her veins as her mind tried to process what had just happened. Nick was already moving, checking the room for any remaining threats. His footsteps echoed softly on the concrete floor as he kept his rifle aimed, his eyes scanning every corner. There was no telling how many men were still out there. Victor's death didn't guarantee their safety. In fact, it probably made things worse. Lila stood slowly, her knees creaking as she wiped her hand across her forehead, pushing back strands of hair. She could feel the sting of bloodshot eyes, the burn of exhaustion. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. Lila. Nick's voice cut through her thoughts. We need to move. Now. She nodded, tucking the gun back into its holster. What about Weston? Nick's expression darkened. Gone. Slipped out the back when things got hot. He knew the moment to bail. Lila swore under her breath. Weston was the key to everything, and now he was gone, leaving nothing but the wreckage of their failed mission behind. But there was still a thread she could pull, a lead she couldn't ignore. She turned to Victor's body, crouching beside him to check for anything useful. There was nothing in his pockets, no sign of anything that could point to who was pulling the strings behind all of this. But she noticed something else. A small, torn piece of paper clutched tightly in his hand. It was stained with blood, the ink smudged, but the faint outline of a name was still legible. Lila's heart skipped. It wasn't just any name. It was the name of someone she had hoped to never encounter again. Damn it, Lila muttered, standing quickly, the piece of paper clenched in her fist. Nick glanced at the paper in her hand, his brows furrowing. Bennett? You know him? Lila nodded grimly. I know him. Too well. Jasper Bennett had been a ghost in the world of mercenaries and rogue operations, a man whose name had been whispered in the darkest corners of the underworld. But he wasn't just any contractor. Bennett was the kind of man who left a trail of destruction wherever he went, someone who made sure you were erased long before you realized you were a target. And now, somehow, he was involved in this operation. I thought he was dead, Lila muttered, more to herself than Nick. Everyone thought he was dead, but the name was right there, written in Victor's blood-stained hand. And if Bennett was alive, that changed everything. We need to find him, Lila said, her voice cold with resolve. And we need to find out what the hell he's planning. Nick nodded, but his face remained tight with worry. You know what that means, right? We're not just dealing with some ragtag operation anymore. Bennett's not in this for the money. He's got something bigger in mind. Lila's eyes narrowed. She knew, but the weight of what that could mean didn't faze her. Not yet. Bennett's operations had always been about control. Control of people, of information, of systems. If he was behind Weston and Victor, then the stakes had just been raised exponentially. Let's get out of here, Lila said, turning toward the exit. We need to regroup. The mission's not over. Not by a long shot. As she stepped toward the door, she could hear the distant sound of sirens, the inevitable approach of local authorities. They had to move fast. Nick followed her, his voice low. Where do we go now? Lila stopped in her tracks, her hand hovering over the door handle. The city outside might have been the safest place to hide, but it was also the most dangerous. There were eyes everywhere, and if Bennett had his sights set on her, on all of them, it wouldn't be long before the city's underworld would be on their tail too. I know someone who might be able to help, Lila said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. We need to head to the safe house. It's the only place we'll be able to figure out our next move. Nick didn't ask any more questions. He knew better by now. Lila was always 5 steps ahead, even when it seemed like the world was falling apart. They moved swiftly through the dark alleyways, avoiding the main streets where their faces might be recognized. They needed information. They needed to figure out just how deep the rabbit hole went and how to stop it before it swallowed them whole. The safe house was tucked away in a quiet, nondescript neighborhood, a far cry from the city's pulse. It was a place for people who needed to disappear, a place where the rest of the world could be forgotten, even if only for a little while. Lila sat at a makeshift desk in the corner of the room, her eyes scanning the maps and intel spread out before her. Nick had gone to check the perimeter, but Lila couldn't focus on anything but the name in her hand. The more she thought about him, the more the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. There had been rumors of a resurgence in certain circles, whispers of a new wave of operations, more deadly, more intricate than anything before. But Lila hadn't believed it. Bennett had always been a ghost, and she had assumed he'd stayed buried with the rest of the dead. But now she knew the truth. Bennett was out there, pulling strings, and whoever had been behind this mission wasn't just interested in selling weapons or taking lives. They were building something bigger, something far more dangerous. The door creaked open, and Nick stepped inside, his face grim. We've got a problem. Lila stood up, her heart tightening. What is it? Nick glanced at the map on the table, then back at her. I've been tracking Bennett's known contacts. They're moving, fast. It looks like he's preparing for something big. Lila didn't wait for him to finish. She was already grabbing her gear, her mind racing. We're going after him, she said. Now. As the search for Jasper Bennett intensifies, Lila and Nick find themselves on the edge of a deadly game, with forces far beyond their control closing in. The truth is darker than they could have imagined, and the consequences of failing to stop Bennett could change everything. The safe house was cloaked in shadows, the dim light from a single bulb casting long, distorted shapes across the walls. Lila sat at the table, her hands trembling slightly as she reviewed the intel they had gathered. The map in front of her was dotted with locations, safe houses, warehouses, abandoned buildings, all linked to Jasper Bennett. But there was no pattern, no clear direction, and time was running out. We need to hit him before he can get whatever it is he's planning off the ground, Lila said, her voice steady despite the anxiety bubbling beneath the surface. We need to know what he's really after. Nick leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, his brow furrowed. You think he's already making his move? Lila glanced up, meeting his eyes. I don't think he's waiting for permission. We've seen his methods. The longer we wait, the more time he has to cover his tracks. Nick's gaze shifted to the map. His fingers tapped the surface lightly. We've got one shot at this, Lila. We can't afford to go in blind. Lila exhaled, standing up and pacing the room, her mind working furiously. Bennett wasn't just dangerous. He was calculating. His movements were always deliberate, and there was no such thing as coincidence with him. Everything had a purpose. Every decision was part of a larger plan, a web of lies and manipulation. The only way to catch him was to think like him. She stopped pacing and looked at Nick. There's one lead we haven't checked. One person who might have more answers. Nick raised an eyebrow. Who? Lila's jaw tightened. Megan Turner. Megan? Nick repeated, his voice laced with skepticism. She's been off the grid for years. We have no idea where to even start looking for her. I know, Lila said, her mind racing with the memory of Megan. The only person who might have known Bennett's operations better than anyone. Megan had been a former associate, someone who had once worked under Bennett before disappearing into the shadows. No one knew why she left or what happened to her, but Lila had a gut feeling that she knew more than anyone realized. We have to find her, Lila pressed. She's the key. If anyone knows what Bennett is planning, it's her. Nick sighed, then nodded. All right, we'll track her down. But we need to be careful. Bennett's network is everywhere. He'll know we're coming if we aren't careful. Lila agreed. Their next move was risky, tracking down a ghost in a city that was teeming with enemies. But it was the only chance they had. And Lila wasn't the type to back down, no matter how high the stakes. The rain came down in sheets, the streets slick with water as Lila and Nick made their way through the narrow alleyways. The city was quieter than usual, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the storm. They had a lead, a small, inconspicuous building on the outskirts of town, one that Megan had frequented before her disappearance. It was a place that existed on the edge of the city's underworld, a safe house for people who didn't want to be found. As they approached the door, Lila could feel the tension in the air, thick with anticipation. This was it. This was the moment that could either lead them to the answers they desperately needed, or get them killed. Lila reached for the door, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the handle, but just as she was about to open it, the sound of a distant car engine echoed through the alley. Her head snapped around, instincts kicking in as she immediately pulled back into the shadows. Nick's hand went to his gun. We've got company. Lila's heart skipped a beat. They weren't alone. Someone had followed them. Or worse, someone had been waiting for them. The car slowed, its headlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the alleyway for a brief moment before the engine shut off. Footsteps followed, deliberate and steady, getting closer. Lila and Nick crouched low, their backs pressed against the brick walls, hearts pounding in their chests. Lila's mind raced. Who could it be? Bennett's men? Or someone else entirely? The footsteps stopped just outside the building, and the sound of a door creaking open sent a chill through Lila's spine. She motioned to Nick, signaling for him to stay put. If they were caught, everything would be over. They had to stay hidden, at least for now. Seconds passed like hours. The sound of rain hitting the pavement was the only thing that filled the silence. Then, the door to the building creaked open, and a familiar figure emerged from the shadows. It was Megan Turner. Lila's breath caught in her throat. There she was, the woman they had been searching for. But something was off. Megan's expression was guarded, her eyes darting around the alley as if she expected someone to be watching. She wasn't here to help them. She was here to run. Lila stepped forward, but Nick held her back, his hand on her arm. He whispered, "We need to be sure it's her, Lila. We can't make a move unless we know for sure." Megan turned to the side, disappearing into the alley. Lila felt her pulse quicken. This was their chance. They couldn't afford to let her slip away again. Taking a deep breath, Lila broke from the shadows, her body moving with purpose. She couldn't let fear or hesitation slow her down now. This was it. Lila and Nick moved swiftly through the alley, staying just out of sight. Megan was fast, too fast. She knew the city like the back of her hand, and every time Lila thought she was closing in, Megan would vanish into another shadow, disappearing from view. But Lila wasn't going to let her get away. Not this time. The answers they needed were just out of reach, and Lila wasn't about to let her only lead slip through her fingers again. As they rounded the corner, Lila's heart skipped. There she was, Megan, standing at the edge of a rooftop, staring out over the city. She hadn't heard them approach. "Megan!" Lila shouted, her voice cutting through the rain. Megan froze, her body tensing, then slowly turned around. Her face was a mask of indifference, but Lila could see the hesitation in her eyes. "Megan," Lila repeated, stepping forward, "we need to talk. About Bennett." The silence stretched on, the only sound the distant rumble of thunder. Megan didn't move, didn't speak, and then, finally, she nodded. "All right," she said, her voice low but steady. "You want answers? You're going to need to come with me." With Megan Turner finally in their sights, Lila and Nick find themselves on the cusp of a revelation that could change everything. But in a world where no one can be trusted, even the truth might be a dangerous weapon. Lila and Nick followed Megan down a narrow stairwell that led them deeper into the bowels of the city. The rain pounded against the metal roof above, but beneath the streets, the air was thick with silence. Every step echoed off the concrete walls, every breath a reminder of the stakes they were now facing. Megan walked ahead without looking back, her pace swift but calculated. She'd clearly done this before. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, Lila's hand instinctively went to her gun. The underground passage was dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights, casting long shadows that twisted unnervingly. Lila could feel the weight of the moment settling over her. Nick, staying close but always alert, leaned in to whisper, "We're too exposed down here. She could lead us into a trap." "I know," Lila replied softly, her eyes scanning their surroundings. "But we don't have a choice. This is the only shot we've got." Megan stopped in front of a heavy door, one that appeared to have been here for decades. It was old, reinforced with steel, and had no visible handles. Megan stood still for a moment before she moved to the side and pressed a hidden button embedded in the wall. The door slid open with a soft, mechanical hum, revealing a small room beyond, barely large enough to fit the three of them comfortably. "Inside," Megan commanded, stepping through without waiting for them to respond. Lila exchanged a brief glance with Nick before they followed her into the small room. The door slid shut behind them, sealing them in with no way out. The walls of the room were lined with old file cabinets and stacks of paper, some neatly organized, others scattered haphazardly. The air smelled faintly of dust and old coffee, and there was a strange hum in the atmosphere, as though something important was just beyond the threshold. Megan walked toward a desk in the center of the room, dropping a thick file onto it with a heavy thud. "Sit," she ordered, her voice firm. Lila hesitated only for a moment before moving to the desk, pulling out a chair and sitting down. Nick stood behind her, his eyes constantly shifting, as if he expected someone, or something, to leap out of the shadows at any moment. Megan sat across from them, her arms folded, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the rain outside and the hum of the fluorescent lights. It was clear she wasn't going to speak until Lila asked the right question. Finally, Lila broke the silence. "We know Bennett is planning something big, something dangerous. You've been connected to him, Megan. You know more than you're letting on. We need to know what he's after." Megan's eyes flickered briefly, just a flash of something behind her cold exterior, but she remained quiet. "You think Bennett is just a businessman?" Megan finally asked, her tone colder than ice. "You think he's just some power-hungry criminal? That's what the world thinks. That's what everyone thinks." Lila's pulse quickened. This wasn't the direction she'd expected. "What are you talking about?" Megan leaned forward, her gaze locking onto Lila's. "You've been chasing the wrong ghost. Bennett isn't just a criminal. He's an asset. A tool. And you're about to get caught in something a lot bigger than you ever imagined." Nick stepped forward, his patience thinning. "What do you mean by asset?" Megan's eyes flicked to the ceiling, as if weighing her words carefully. "The man you've been chasing is just the front. The real operation, the real game, is far more dangerous. Bennett's not just working with criminals. He's working with people at the highest levels. Governments. Corporations. Think bigger than drugs and arms. Think about technology, data, surveillance, things that give someone the power to control everything." Lila's mind raced. She had suspected something like this, but hearing it from Megan made it all feel far more real. So, Bennett's not just running some underground empire. He's part of a global network? Megan nodded slowly. Yes, and you're in the way. The moment you started asking the right questions, you became a target. Lila's stomach churned. The weight of Megan's words hit her like a freight train. Bennett was just a cog in a much larger machine. A machine that could reach further than they'd ever imagined. Everything they thought they knew about the world they were up against had just been turned upside down. Why did you leave? Lila asked, her voice steady despite the unease creeping into her chest. You worked with him. You had a front row seat to all of this. Why walk away? Megan's expression hardened, her jaw tightening. Because I saw where it was heading. I saw how deep the corruption ran. The things they were willing to do to keep control. I couldn't be a part of it anymore. I had to disappear. You're telling me you've been hiding all this time, and now you're willing to help us? Nick's voice was tinged with disbelief. I'm not helping you, Megan said flatly. I'm helping myself. If Bennett is allowed to finish what he started, it won't just be your lives on the line. It'll be everyone's. We're talking about a future where privacy doesn't exist, where every move is tracked, every decision manipulated. If I didn't intervene, it would all be over. Lila sat back in her chair, trying to process everything. And what exactly are we supposed to do about it? How do we stop something this big? Megan's lips twitched into something that could have been a smile, though it looked more like a grimace. We don't stop it. We expose it. And once it's out there, once the world knows what's really going on, we'll have a chance to dismantle it. But it won't be easy. And it won't be quick. Then tell us how, Lila said, her voice fierce. We don't have time to waste. Megan opened the file on the desk, revealing a series of documents, photographs, maps, encrypted messages, and an assortment of names and locations. These are the key players. People who are either funding Bennett or working directly with him. And these, she said, pointing to a set of coordinates on one of the maps, are where you'll find the next phase of his plan. Lila and Nick both leaned in, studying the file with the intensity of soldiers preparing for battle. But just as Lila reached for the paper, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway outside, followed by a loud bang, then another. Get down, Nick shouted, shoving Lila to the ground. Megan reacted in an instant, slamming the file shut and grabbing her gun from a hidden compartment in the desk. They found us. You need to leave. Now. As Lila and Nick scramble to escape the sudden assault, they realize that their fight against Bennett and the global network he's part of is about to get a lot more dangerous. The battle for the truth is only beginning, and the consequences of failure are far greater than they ever imagined. The deafening sound of footsteps grew louder, echoing in the narrow passageway outside the room. Lila's heart pounded in her chest as Nick grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the far corner. The walls felt like they were closing in, the dim lights above flickering in time with her rapid breath. Who the hell is that? Lila whispered urgently, her eyes darting to Megan, who had already taken a defensive stance by the door, her weapon drawn and steady. They know we're here, Megan muttered, her voice a low growl. It's probably Bennett's men. They'll stop at nothing to keep this quiet. Lila's pulse quickened. The revelation that Bennett was connected to a global network had already been a blow to everything she'd known. But now they were being hunted, and with every passing second, the stakes rose higher. There was no way out unless they acted fast. Nick, ever the strategist, crouched low beside Lila, his voice calm but urgent. We need to find another way out. Fast. Megan glanced over at them, a sharp look in her eyes. There's no time for that. If we're lucky, we'll survive long enough to get what we came for. She paused, her hand hovering over the file she placed on the desk. But you need to get to the coordinates. Those are the only thing that matters right now. Lila nodded, her mind racing. The file, everything they needed to take down Bennett and the network, was sitting just inches away. But as the door groaned under the weight of the footsteps growing closer, she knew it might be the last chance they had to get it out. With one final glance at Nick, she darted toward the desk, grabbing the file and tucking it under her arm. The room seemed to spin as she slid back toward the corner, pressing herself against the cold concrete wall. Megan was already at the door, peering out through a small crack. Her face was set in grim determination. "We don't have much time. When I give the signal, we run." The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. The pounding footsteps grew louder until they were right outside the door. Lila could feel the tension in the air, the sense of imminent danger hanging over them like a storm about to break. Then, without warning, the door exploded open, sending a surge of cold air and chaos into the room. "Move!" Megan shouted, and Lila was already on her feet, her legs moving before her brain could process the danger. Nick shot forward, grabbing Lila's arm and pulling her with him as they bolted for the narrow hallway behind them. Behind them, gunfire erupted, the sharp cracks of the bullets punctuating the air. Lila's heart hammered in her chest as she ran, every muscle screaming with adrenaline. Megan was ahead of them, her movements swift and calculated. She knew this place, knew the layout of the underground hideout like the back of her hand. Another burst of gunfire rang out, and Lila stumbled as a bullet grazed the wall beside her, the force of it sending a jolt through her body. Nick caught her, keeping her on her feet, but they were losing ground. "There's an exit up ahead," Megan yelled, pointing toward a metal grate at the end of the hall. "We're almost there." But just as they reached the grate, the sound of more footsteps came from the opposite direction. They were trapped. Lila's mind raced, the weight of the file still heavy against her side. Bennett's men were closing in, and if they didn't act fast, they'd be cornered. She didn't even think, just acted on instinct. She pulled the grate open with all the strength she could muster, her hands shaking with urgency. The metallic screech echoed through the hallway, followed by another round of gunfire from behind them. "Go!" Megan yelled, her voice steady but urgent. "I'll hold them off." Without hesitation, Lila slid through the opening first, followed by Nick, both of them landing hard on the wet ground outside. The rain was pouring down in sheets, the city skyline a blur in the distance. They were exposed now, and they had no idea where they were going. Megan was right behind them, her eyes scanning the street. "This way," she ordered, leading them down an alley that twisted sharply to the left. Lila didn't dare look back. The file was still clutched tightly under her arm, and she could feel the weight of the secrets it held pressing down on her. The storm was only beginning, and they were in the eye of it. As they moved quickly through the alley, Megan paused to glance over her shoulder. "They're still coming, but they won't be able to track us for long. I know this city better than they do." Nick didn't say anything, but his grip on Lila tightened. They were running out of time. The fact that Bennett's men were this close meant that they had to make their next move soon, before the network could erase everything they had worked for. Lila took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "Where do we go from here?" Megan shot her a grim look. "To the people who can make this public. We need to make sure this gets into the right hands. The coordinates in that file? They lead to the next phase of Bennett's operation. And if we don't expose it, he wins." The urgency in Megan's voice struck Lila like a slap. There was no more time for hesitation. If they didn't take action now, the truth would be buried forever, and so would they. As Lila and Nick flee into the storm, with Bennett's men hot on their trail, the file becomes their only hope. But they know that with every passing moment, the network closes in tighter around them. The battle to expose the truth has only just begun. The cold, relentless rain hit Lila's face like tiny needles, soaking through her clothes as she sprinted after Megan and Nick. The city streets blurred in the storm's haze, the neon lights casting eerie reflections on the slick pavement. They were running blind, but it was the only option they had left. Megan led the way, her pace steady and determined. She seemed to know exactly where she was going, her body instinctively dodging the shadows, avoiding any sign of pursuit. Behind them, the sound of heavy boots splashed through the waterlogged streets, growing louder with each passing second. They were still being chased, but Lila had no idea how long they could outrun them. "We need to get to the safe house," Megan called over her shoulder, her voice cutting through the rain. "We'll be safe there, at least for a little while." Lila didn't question it. She just followed, trusting Megan's experience. She couldn't afford to think about anything else. The file she held was all that mattered now, and the truth it contained could bring down everything Bennett had worked for. But the closer they got to uncovering it, the more dangerous the game became. Nick was right behind her, his hand never leaving her arm as they ran, pulling her along with a sense of urgency. His grip was tight, like a lifeline in the chaos, but Lila couldn't help but wonder how long they could keep this up. The storm made it hard to hear anything else, but she knew they had precious little time. Megan stopped suddenly, and Lila almost collided with her. Ahead, a pair of headlights cut through the downpour, their bright beam flashing over the alleyway they were in. "Get down," Megan hissed. The three of them ducked behind a rusted dumpster, crouching low to the ground. Lila's heart raced as the car slowed, its engine humming ominously in the quiet night. The headlights swept back and forth, scanning the alley. Lila held her breath, praying they wouldn't be spotted. The car stopped. The sound of a door creaking open echoed through the alley, followed by the sharp click of footsteps. A figure stepped out, tall and imposing, his silhouette barely visible through the rain. "Where are they?" The voice was deep and cold, and Lila's blood ran cold. She recognized it immediately. It was Bennett's right-hand man, Ray. The footsteps were steady, purposeful, as Ray approached the alley. Lila's pulse quickened, the realization hitting her like a punch to the gut. They were too close. Bennett's men had caught up to them. "Ray," Megan whispered, "we have to move." Lila couldn't see what Megan was planning, but she trusted her. In a fluid motion, Megan reached into her jacket and pulled out a small device. She pressed a button, and suddenly, a loud sound erupted from behind them, a car alarm, blaring and shrill. "Go!" Megan barked, and the three of them bolted, dashing down the alley as fast as their legs could carry them. Behind them, Ray's angry voice shouted to his team, but it was too late. They were already gone. Lila's breath came in sharp bursts as they veered through a narrow gap between two buildings, emerging onto a quieter street. The rain had let up slightly, but the threat of pursuit still hung in the air. "We're almost there," Megan panted, her eyes scanning the streets for any sign of danger. "Stay sharp." They moved quickly, turning onto a smaller, dimly lit street that led them to an old, unmarked door nestled between two boarded-up buildings. Megan approached it with the precision of someone who had done this 100 times before. She knocked twice, then paused, waiting for the response. A small, narrow slit in the door slid open, and a pair of sharp eyes peered through. "Password," a gravelly voice demanded. Megan didn't hesitate. "Silver bullet." The slit closed, and there was a faint click before the door creaked open. Lila and Nick followed Megan inside, into the dimly lit hallway that smelled faintly of old wood and stale air. The door slammed shut behind them, sealing out the storm. Inside, the walls were lined with old furniture and stacks of papers, the space claustrophobic yet oddly comforting. The dim lighting cast long shadows across the room, giving everything a sense of secrecy, like a hidden world in the heart of the city. "This is the safe house?" Lila asked, her voice still shaky from the adrenaline. Megan nodded, her expression serious but calm. "It'll do for now. We can regroup, figure out our next move." Nick looked around, scanning their surroundings, his face grim. "I don't know how much longer we can keep running, Megan. They're closing in fast. And Bennett, he's not going to stop until he gets that file." Megan set her jaw. "We need to make sure he never gets it. We'll expose him before that happens. But we need to stay one step ahead." Lila clutched the file tightly against her chest. The weight of it seemed heavier now, the pressure of what it held settling on her shoulders. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about taking down a network that had controlled far too many lives for far too long. "You said there were people who could help us," Lila said, her voice steady despite the tension that gripped her. "People who can get this to the right hands?" Megan nodded. "Yes. But it's risky. We'll need to trust them completely." "We don't have a choice," Lila said, her mind made up. "We'll do whatever it takes." Nick gave her a sharp look, but didn't argue. Instead, he moved to the small desk in the corner, pulling out his phone. "I'm calling in a favor," he said. "We need to move fast, or this whole thing will fall apart." Megan set the file down on the table in front of them. The coordinates, the names, the information about the next phase of Bennett's plan. Everything they needed to end this nightmare was right there. "Once we do this," Megan said quietly. There's no going back. Bennett will know we're coming for him. Lila met her gaze, her resolve hardening. Then let's make sure he knows it's too late. As the safe house provides a momentary refuge, Lila, Nick, and Megan prepare for their final push to expose Bennett's operation. But with the clock ticking, the risks are greater than ever, and the next move could mean everything or nothing at all. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound in the room as Lila sat at the small table, the file still before her. Megan had stepped away to make a few calls, and Nick was on the couch, scrolling through his phone with a look of quiet concentration. It was the first real break they'd had in days, but it didn't feel like relief. Every minute that passed, the stakes climbed higher. Bennett was relentless. He would stop at nothing to get what they had. Lila flipped through the file again, trying to calm the storm of thoughts in her head. Every page was a revelation, but also a complication. Bennett wasn't just a local player. His reach stretched farther than they'd imagined, with ties to people in high places. The operation wasn't just criminal. It was political, systemic, and it was only a matter of time before the wrong people found out what they were trying to do. She pressed her fingers to her temples, trying to focus on the task at hand. She'd never signed up for something this big, this dangerous. It wasn't just about stopping a corrupt businessman. This was about taking down a machine that had been operating in the shadows for decades. The implications were massive, and it was all sitting in her hands. Nick's voice broke through her thoughts. You okay? She looked up, meeting his concerned gaze. He hadn't moved from the couch, but the intensity of his focus hadn't wavered. Yeah, just thinking. She swallowed hard. It's just so much, you know? Nick nodded, his expression softening. I get it, but we're in this together. All we can do now is finish it. Bennett's not going to stop until we're either dead or disappeared. So we've got to hit him where it hurts before he has the chance. Lila didn't say anything. She just turned the page of the file, absorbing more of the details that had been painstakingly collected by the people who had come before her. She could feel the weight of their legacy on her shoulders, the lives that had been lost in the struggle against Bennett's empire. Her phone buzzed suddenly, pulling her attention away from the file. She glanced at the screen, the name flashing in bold letters. Megan. Lila, Megan said when Lila answered. Her voice was clipped, urgent. We've got a problem. Lila felt the blood drain from her face. What's happened? It's Ray. He's found us. They're close. Lila shot to her feet, her heart hammering in her chest. How do you know? Megan's voice lowered to a whisper, as if she were afraid someone might overhear. I just got a tip. Bennett's men are watching the safe house. It won't be long before they make their move. Nick was on his feet now, his face hard with resolve. What do we do? Lila's mind raced. They couldn't stay here. They couldn't afford to be cornered. Get out, she said, her voice sharper than she intended. We need to move now. We've got to get to the drop point. It's our only chance. Megan's response was grim. Understood. I'll cover the rear. Lila ended the call, her mind already racing through their options. She grabbed the file, clutching it tightly in her hands. Every second counted. Nick grabbed his jacket from the chair, moving quickly. I'll start the car. We'll take the back alley. Lila nodded, already at the door. Make sure you don't get spotted. We can't afford any mistakes now. They moved in sync, the urgency of the moment pushing them forward. As they stepped into the rain-soaked street, the city around them seemed colder, darker, more oppressive than ever. The storm had picked up again, the wind howling through the empty streets as if it, too, were preparing for the chaos that was about to erupt. The safe house wasn't far from the drop point, but they needed to be fast. The further they stayed from the safe house, the less vulnerable they'd be to Bennett's men. They passed darkened windows and boarded up storefronts, their footsteps echoing eerily in the silence of the city's deserted streets. Lila's mind was spinning, but one thought stood out above the rest. They were running out of time. They made it to the car, an unmarked sedan parked several blocks away. Nick was already in the driver's seat, the engine running. Lila slid into the passenger seat, clutching the file against her chest. She had no idea if they'd make it to the drop point without getting caught, but she had to believe they would. Let's go, she said, her voice tight. Nick floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as they sped off into the night. The city's lights flickered in the rearview mirror as they disappeared into the darkness, but Lila knew it wouldn't be long before Bennett's men came after them. And then, as if on cue, the first shot rang out. It was sharp, loud, and close, too close. Lila's heart skipped a beat, and she whipped her head toward the back window. In the distance, she could see the glint of headlights, just a shadow of a car, but it was coming fast. Bennett's men had found them. "They're following us," Nick shouted, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel. "Hold on." Lila's pulse quickened. The file felt like it was burning a hole in her hands, the weight of it pressing down on her like an anchor. "Don't stop," she shouted. "Just get us to the drop point." Nick didn't hesitate. He swerved around the corner, pushing the car harder as the chase began in earnest. The city's streets blurred around them as they raced toward the unknown. In the back of her mind, Lila knew this was it. There was no turning back now. Whatever happened next, they had to make sure that file reached the right hands. It was the only way to make Bennett's empire fall. As the pursuit intensifies, Lila and Nick race against time to reach the drop point. With Bennett's men closing in, the stakes have never been higher. The engine roared as Nick pushed the accelerator to its limits, swerving around corners and cutting through the rain-soaked streets like a shadow. The sound of the tires skimming against wet asphalt was the only thing Lila could hear over the pounding of her heart. She glanced over her shoulder, but the headlights behind them had already merged with the darkness, making it impossible to gauge how close Bennett's men were. Still, she knew they were there. The question was, how long could they stay ahead? "Take the next left," Lila snapped, pointing toward an alley that led to a series of industrial buildings. It wasn't the fastest route, but it would be harder to follow without getting noticed. Nick's eyes flickered to her, his jaw clenched in concentration. "You sure about this?" "Yes, just do it." He jerked the wheel, sending the car into the alley just as another shot rang out, the bullet grazing the rear bumper. Lila flinched, but she didn't let it distract her. The sound of the gunfire was like a slap to her senses, pulling her into the moment. They were close. The alley was narrow, with old dumpsters and crates piled high along the walls. The rain had turned the ground into a slick mess of puddles, but Nick maneuvered through it with practiced ease. Lila's gaze darted between the rearview mirror and the dark, wet path ahead. Her pulse was thudding in her throat, but she kept her breathing steady. She couldn't afford to panic now. Up ahead, the alley opened up into a small courtyard, the perfect place to make the drop. They had arranged to meet someone, an informant who could take the file and disappear, ensuring the documents reached the right people. It was the only plan they had left, and it had to work. "Just a little further," Lila murmured, barely aware of the words as they tumbled from her lips. Nick didn't respond, his focus unwavering. He took a sharp right, slowing the car as they approached the empty lot. There was a rusted gate at the far end, and a lone figure stood near the chain-link fence, hooded and barely visible in the shadows. Lila felt a pang of relief. It was him, her contact. They had made it. "Park here," she ordered, her hand gripping the door handle as she prepared to make a quick exit. Nick didn't need to be told twice. He slammed the car into park, and Lila was already out of the vehicle before the engine had stopped humming. She darted toward the contact, the file still clutched tightly in her hand, her breath coming in sharp bursts. The figure turned just as she reached him. It was hard to make out his face in the dim light, but his stance was unmistakable. He was a man who had seen the worst of the world and survived it. "You're late," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. Lila didn't waste time with pleasantries. "They're on our tail. You need to get this to the authorities. Now." She handed him the file, her fingers lingering on the cold, weathered paper for a moment longer than necessary. This was it. This was the end of the line. The man took the file without a word, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the courtyard before he tucked it into his jacket. "Don't worry," he said, his voice firm. "It'll get to the right place. You've done your part." Just then, the screech of tires echoed through the alley, followed by the unmistakable sound of a car coming to a halt. Lila's heart skipped a beat. "Shit, they're here," Nick muttered under his breath, already heading for the car. He didn't wait for Lila to respond. just sprinted toward the vehicle, ready to put as much distance between them and their pursuers as possible. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, followed by shouting. It was Bennett's men. They were too close now. Go, go! Lila yelled, already sprinting toward the car. The man who had taken the file was nowhere to be seen, already melting into the shadows as if he'd never existed. It was just the two of them now, Lila and Nick. They reached the car just as the first figures rounded the corner, their dark silhouettes barely visible in the rain. Nick threw the car into drive, and they tore out of the courtyard, skidding around the corner and back into the street. Don't stop, Lila breathed, her eyes locked on the rearview mirror. The headlights were there again, getting closer with every passing second. Nick didn't need to be told twice. He pushed the car harder, weaving between the deserted streets, desperately trying to shake the tail. But it wasn't long before the sound of a car engine revving behind them signaled the beginning of a high-speed pursuit. Lila braced herself against the seat, her eyes darting from the mirror to the road ahead. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes now. The rain was falling harder, blurring the streets, making it harder to see the twists and turns that lay ahead. Nick's grip tightened on the wheel as he took another sharp corner, the tires screeching in protest. Lila gripped the door handle, her knuckles white, her heart racing. The road stretched out before them, empty and dark, but that wouldn't last. Bennett's men were relentless, and the longer they stayed on the move, the closer they were to being cornered. Lila's mind raced. She had to think, and she had to think fast. We need to get off the main road, she said urgently. Take the side streets. They're not going to expect us to head into the industrial zone. Nick glanced at her, a look of determination in his eyes. On it. They veered off the main street, plunging into an area filled with warehouses and rundown buildings. The roads were narrower here, and the alleyways offered more places to hide. But they also made it easier for Bennett's men to box them in. Lila gritted her teeth. They had to lose them. They had to make sure that file made it into the right hands, no matter what. The race against time intensifies as Lila and Nick find themselves in the crosshairs of Bennett's men. The drop has been made, but the danger is far from over. What comes next will determine everything. The industrial zone was a labyrinth of old warehouses and crumbling infrastructure, the kind of place where shadows could swallow a person whole. Nick was pushing the car as fast as it could go, but the squeal of tires was only drowned out by the sound of the pursuing vehicles closing in. They were relentless, faster than Nick had anticipated. Nick, we need to lose them now, Lila urged, her voice tight with tension. She glanced at the rearview mirror again. 2 cars now, one directly behind them, the other a bit farther off, but catching up. I know, Nick said, his knuckles white on the wheel, trying to get us some breathing room. They slammed through a series of narrow streets, narrowly missing a stack of crates as Nick swerved to avoid a pileup of metal debris. The tires screeched, and for a moment, it felt like the car might spin out of control. But Nick wasn't giving up that easily. He gritted his teeth, pushing harder, his eyes scanning the road ahead. Lila's heart pounded in her chest. Every turn they took, every alley they darted into, she could feel Bennett's men closing in. They were getting too close for comfort, too close for her to feel like there was a real chance to get away. Think, Lila. Think, she told herself, her fingers tapping against her leg as she racked her brain for something, anything, that could give them a moment of advantage. Up ahead, she saw a large, vacant parking structure. There was a narrow entrance on the side, exactly the kind of place they could use to disappear. If they could just make it there before Bennett's men saw them, they might be able to make a clean getaway. Nick, take a right at the next intersection. There's a parking structure. We can lose them in there, she said, a plan forming in her mind. Nick nodded without hesitation. Got it. The car jerked as he made the sharp turn, tires skidding as they narrowly avoided a set of concrete pillars. Lila held her breath. If they didn't make this turn smoothly, they'd end up tangled in a mess of wreckage. But Nick's hands were steady. The car shot down the side street, and up ahead, the parking structure loomed. It was a dilapidated, abandoned lot, one of the many places that had been left to rot as the city's industrial sector crumbled. Perfect for a quick escape. There. Lila pointed ahead. Go straight into the structure. We'll head up. Nick gunned the engine, taking the sharp turn into the parking lot. The car bounced over the uneven surface, and Lila's stomach lurched as they sped into the darkness of the structure. They could hear the sounds of the other cars screeching to a halt as they tried to follow them into the narrow entrance, but it was too late. The parking structure was a maze of dark corners and empty spaces, and the echo of their own tires on the concrete would drown out any hope of being found in the maze. Nick sped to the top level, where they parked in a corner, out of sight. They sat in the car for a moment, just breathing, the silence around them thick with tension. Lila looked at Nick. Are they still there? Nick's hands were gripping the wheel tightly, his knuckles pale. He nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. They're still circling, but they don't know where we are. Not yet. Lila's chest tightened. They will soon. They'll figure it out. Then we need to make sure they don't find us, Nick said, his voice low and grim. He exhaled slowly, as if trying to compose himself. We'll have to wait it out. Lila knew he was right. There wasn't much they could do now except keep their heads down and wait for the opportunity to slip past Bennett's men. The file was in the right hands, but they still had to get out of this alive. Suddenly, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out quickly, her eyes flicking to the screen. The message was from an encrypted number she knew all too well. The file has been received. Make sure you don't get caught. I'll keep my end of the bargain. Relief flooded her chest. At least the mission was a success. At least something had gone right tonight. Lila glanced at Nick. We did it. The file's where it needs to be. Good, Nick replied, exhaling slowly. But now we need to get the hell out of here. Lila nodded, glancing out the window. The car was hidden in the shadows, but Bennett's men would still be looking. She knew it. They weren't just going to give up. They'll be watching the exits, she said, her mind already working. We need to find a way to get out of here without them seeing us. Nick's eyes narrowed as he looked out the window. The sound of tires screeching from the lower levels echoed through the structure. Bennett's men were starting to fan out. They had to make their move, and fast. Nick turned the ignition. I've got an idea, but it's going to be risky. Riskier than this? Lila raised an eyebrow, trying to mask her unease with a smirk. I was thinking we go through the roof, Nick said. If we climb up to the highest level, we can get out without them spotting us. It's not ideal, but it's better than waiting for them to figure us out down here. Lila's heart skipped a beat. The roof? You're serious? Nick grinned, a dangerous gleam in his eyes. Only way out now, right? Lila didn't hesitate. Let's do it. They climbed out of the car, moving swiftly and silently through the darkness of the parking structure. The higher they climbed, the quieter it became, until they reached the top level, the wind howling around them. Below, the sound of engines revving and men shouting echoed, but they were no longer visible from this vantage point. Lila's nerves were on edge, her heart hammering in her chest. But there was no turning back now. They had to make it. She followed Nick as he led the way across the rooftop, his movements sure and confident. Every step felt like a countdown, the pressure mounting with every passing second. The only thing on her mind was survival. They reached the edge of the building, looking down at the alley below. There was a fire escape, barely visible from the roof. There, Nick said, pointing. We climbed down there, then out through the alley. We'll lose them in the crowds. Lila nodded, feeling the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. They had one shot at this. If they missed it, everything they'd done would be for nothing. She followed Nick as he carefully made his way down the fire escape, her breath catching in her throat. They had come so close, and now they were on the edge of freedom. But the chase wasn't over. Not yet. Lila and Nick have made it to the roof, but escaping Bennett's men is no easy task. Every step forward brings them closer to safety, or closer to falling into the hands of their enemies. The wind howled as Lila and Nick descended the fire escape, their boots clanging against the metal rungs. Each step felt like a countdown, each creak of the structure a reminder of how precarious their situation was. Below, the alley stretched out in the dim light of a flickering street lamp, the shadows playing tricks on their minds. Lila's heart raced, adrenaline coursing through her veins. They had to make it to the street. They had to make it to the crowd before Bennett's men figured out where they were. Stay low, Nick whispered, his voice tense but steady. Lila nodded, crouching as she reached the bottom of the fire escape. She glanced around quickly, eyes scanning for movement, her senses heightened. The alley was eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of city traffic and the occasional shout from Bennett's men. They were still looking for them, but they didn't know they were so close. "We're almost there," Nick muttered under his breath, his eyes darting over his shoulder, alert to any approaching danger. Lila moved quickly, her shoes tapping lightly against the concrete as she followed him into the shadows. They kept their movements deliberate and slow, their breaths shallow. There was a crowd ahead, a few people milling around outside a late-night diner. If they could reach that, they'd have a chance to blend in, to disappear. Nick looked back, his expression grim. Just a few more steps. Lila's gaze locked on the diner. The flickering neon sign buzzed in the night air. Her pulse quickened as they neared the entrance, and she could feel the tension mounting. They were so close, but she knew it wasn't over yet. The moment they stepped into the crowd, they would become just another face in the sea of people, but there was still that moment of risk, the brief second where Bennett's men might spot them. They reached the edge of the crowd, and Nick gave her a quick nod before slipping into the throng of people, his movements smooth, casual. Lila followed suit, her body pressing against the backs of strangers, blending in, becoming part of the background. She could hear the footsteps of the men behind them, faint but growing louder. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she felt the weight of their gaze, even if they didn't know exactly where she and Nick were. Just as they neared the door of the diner, Lila's phone buzzed again. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. "Not now," she whispered under her breath. Nick's voice was urgent but quiet. "You need to answer it, Lila. It could be important." Lila hesitated, fingers trembling as she pulled the phone from her pocket. She glanced at the screen. Another encrypted message. "They're closing in. You need to get out of the city. Now." Her stomach twisted. Whoever was sending the messages knew what was happening. They knew Bennett's men were already tracking their every move. "I'm not staying here," Lila whispered to Nick, panic creeping into her voice. "We need to get out of the city. They know we're here." Nick's eyes darkened as he scanned the crowd, his hand gripping her arm to pull her closer. "We'll go to my place. It's out of the way. We can figure out what's next from there." Lila hesitated, but the urgency in his voice left her with little choice. "All right, but we need to hurry." They slipped further into the crowd, moving with the steady flow of people. Lila kept her head down, focusing on the ground beneath her feet, trying to ignore the looming threat of the men who were still hunting for them. Every footstep felt like a drumbeat in her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that at any moment someone would grab her, or a hand would close around her wrist. Then, a voice sliced through the murmur of the crowd. "There they are. Don't let them escape." Lila's blood ran cold. It was them, Bennett's men. Without thinking, she grabbed Nick's arm, pulling him toward the alleyway that led to the back of the diner. "Move!" she hissed, her breath ragged. They sprinted down the narrow path, the sound of pounding feet echoing behind them. Lila's heart raced as she focused on the alley ahead, her mind telling her to keep moving, to not stop, to not think about the men getting closer. "Come on," Nick urged, his voice low and frantic. "We're almost there." They reached a dead-end alley, the walls towering high on either side. No way out. They were trapped. Lila's mind raced, but there was no time for hesitation. She turned to Nick, her eyes wild with panic. "What now?" Nick cursed under his breath, his hand running through his hair in frustration. Then, his gaze fixed on something across the alley. A fire escape. It wasn't much, but it was their only chance. "Climb," Nick ordered. Now. They had no choice. Without a second thought, they dashed toward the fire escape, Nick leading the way. He grabbed the first rung and started to climb, pulling Lila up after him. She scrambled behind him, every muscle in her body screaming, but there was no time to stop. The men were getting closer. She could hear their footsteps pounding in the alley below. When they reached the top, Lila pulled herself onto the roof, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Nick was already on the other side, peering down into the next building's rooftop. "Stay low," he said. We can move across the rooftops. We'll lose them in the maze. Lila nodded, her mind clouded with panic and exhaustion. She was trying to focus, trying to think straight, but the pressure was overwhelming. Every second felt like it could be her last. They crouched low, darting from rooftop to rooftop, moving as quickly as they could. Below, the sound of sirens began to wail, but it wasn't enough to stop Bennett's men. They were still after them. But there was no turning back now. The city sprawled out beneath them, a maze of buildings and alleyways. Lila's heart hammered in her chest as they moved, the realization hitting her. The stakes had never been higher. She wasn't just running for her life anymore. She was running for the truth. And she wasn't going to let Bennett win. Lila and Nick have narrowly escaped Bennett's men, but their journey is far from over. With danger still lurking around every corner, they must continue to fight for their lives and for the truth. The chill of the night air cut through Lila's jacket as they crouched on the rooftop, watching the city below. The distant hum of traffic was now punctuated by the shrill wail of sirens, their sound echoing through the streets like a warning. But to Lila, the noise was almost a comfort. It meant the authorities were at least aware of the chaos unfolding, even if they couldn't stop it. Nick crouched beside her, his eyes scanning the shadows. His face was pale, his jaw clenched tightly, but there was no time to speak. They both knew the urgency of their situation. They had to keep moving. Bennett's men would be searching the city from every angle, and Lila knew that as long as they stayed in one place, it was only a matter of time before they were found. "We can't stay on the rooftops forever," Nick murmured, his voice barely audible against the wind. "We need to get to my car, but it's a few blocks away. If we're spotted, we won't be," Lila cut in, her voice firm despite the knot of fear in her stomach. "We'll be careful. We stick to the back alleys, keep our heads down. They won't see us." Nick looked at her for a moment, the hard edge in his gaze softening just slightly. "Right. Stay low. Follow me." They moved quickly, crouching behind air conditioning units and chimneys as they hopped from one rooftop to the next, careful not to draw attention. The air felt thick with tension as they crossed the narrow gaps between buildings, the sound of their movements lost in the wind that whipped through the city. Lila's thoughts were a blur. They had gotten this far by the skin of their teeth, but it wasn't enough. The truth was still out there, buried under layers of lies and deceit. Bennett, the people behind him. She couldn't let them silence her now. She couldn't let him win. The city spread out beneath them, a maze of streets, alleyways, and dark corners. It was so easy to get lost in the crowds, to disappear. But it was also easy to be hunted. And tonight, that's exactly what they were. Nick reached the edge of the next building and glanced down into the alley below. It was empty, but he didn't hesitate. He swung his leg over the edge of the rooftop, dropping down to the fire escape below. Lila followed, her feet light but sure as she landed beside him. They continued their trek through the back alleys, keeping to the shadows. It was quieter here, the streets bathed in the dim glow of old streetlights. The scent of rain lingered in the air, promising a storm that would only add to the chaos. They had to hurry. "We're almost there," Nick said, his voice tight. "Just a few more turns." Lila nodded, her pulse quickening as they approached the main street. In the distance, she could see the faint glow of the headlights of Nick's car parked at the curb. But before they could get any closer, the sound of a car door slamming shut made her freeze. A man's voice, low and angry, echoed through the alley. "They're close. I know they are. They can't have gone far." Lila's breath caught in her throat. Bennett's men had closed in. They were only a few yards away. "Nick," she whispered urgently. "They're right behind us." Nick's eyes flicked toward the street. "Stay here," he said in a low voice. "I'll go first. Just give me a second to get them off our trail." Lila didn't have time to argue. She nodded, pulling back into the shadow of a nearby doorway, her body tense and alert. Nick moved swiftly, darting into the street like a shadow himself. He was smart, Lila knew that much. He'd worked in the city long enough to know how to lose a tail. But even with his skills, she knew it was only a matter of time before they found him, or her. Seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity. Then, just as quickly as Nick had disappeared into the night, he was back. He motioned for her to follow, his expression tight with urgency. They're distracted. We can move, he whispered. Lila's heart raced as she stepped from her hiding place, moving quickly toward the car. Nick opened the door, and they both slid into the seats, the engine roaring to life. Nick slammed the gearshift into drive, and they sped off into the night. The city lights flickered outside the window as the car tore through the empty streets, the sound of tires on wet pavement the only thing filling the silence. Lila stared out the window, her mind racing. They were free, for now. But Bennett wouldn't stop. Not until he had what he wanted. "We can't keep running, Nick," she said, her voice quieter now, the weight of the situation finally hitting her. "We need a plan. We need to expose Bennett. Get this story out there before it's too late." Nick's jaw clenched as he gripped the steering wheel. "I know, but we can't do it alone. We need allies, people who can help us, people who can make this go public." Lila's thoughts turned to the contacts she had left, the people who might still be able to help. But even if they reached out, even if they managed to get the truth into the open, it would be a battle. Bennett had powerful friends, people who would do anything to protect him, to keep the truth buried. "We'll find them," Lila said firmly, her eyes narrowing. "We have to." Nick didn't respond immediately. Instead, he kept his eyes on the road, his focus unwavering. Minutes later, the car slowed as they turned off the main street and into a quieter neighborhood. The streets here were narrower, darker. The kind of place where people kept to themselves. The kind of place where they might be able to lay low for a while. Nick pulled the car into an alley and parked, cutting the engine. They sat in silence for a moment, both of them catching their breath, letting the tension ease, just a little. Lila looked over at him, meeting his eyes. "What now?" Nick's gaze was intense, determined. "Now, we plan. We get ready for the next move." They were in this together. And though the road ahead was uncertain, they would face it side by side. Because this was just the beginning. Lila and Nick have managed to escape, but the battle is far from over. With danger still closing in, they must find a way to expose the truth and defeat Bennett before it's too late. The quiet of the alley wrapped around Lila like a heavy blanket. Nick's car sat still, its headlights casting long shadows along the walls, but it felt like time itself had come to a standstill. She could hear her heartbeat thumping in her ears, drowning out the rest of the world for a moment. Nick turned off the engine, the sound of the car's hum dying with a soft click. For a moment, neither of them moved. Lila knew they were safe, for now, but safety was a fleeting thing. They'd been running, hiding, trying to stay one step ahead of Bennett's men, but Lila's mind was already racing ahead, thinking of what came next. "Do you have a plan?" Lila finally broke the silence, her voice low but steady. She turned to Nick, who was staring ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Nick's jaw was set. "A plan? We don't have much of a choice right now, Lila." He exhaled sharply, leaning back against the seat. "We need to lay low for a while. We need to figure out who we can trust." Lila nodded, the thought of trust gnawing at her. They couldn't trust anyone in Bennett's circle, not now. But she couldn't shake the feeling that someone had to be on their side. There had to be a way to expose Bennett before he silenced them for good. Nick turned to her, his expression softened slightly. "Look, we've got to get in touch with my contact at the news station. If we can get the story out there, expose Bennett's connections, maybe we can turn the tide." Lila leaned forward, her hands on her lap. "But if we go to the media, it could put a target on us. Bennett has connections everywhere. We'll be even more vulnerable." "I know," Nick replied, his tone firm. "But the longer we wait, the stronger his grip gets. We need to act fast. If we can't trust the law, the media is the next best thing." Lila's mind churned. He wasn't wrong. The more time they spent running, the more power Bennett gained. But could they really trust the media? If someone inside Bennett's organization had influence, they could sabotage their efforts from the inside out. Before Lila could speak, Nick's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen before answering, his voice clipped. "Yeah." A pause, then a woman's voice crackled through the speaker. "Nick, it's me, Samantha. You need to listen to me carefully. Bennett knows you're still alive." Lila's heart skipped a beat. They had barely escaped, and now Bennett was on their tail again. "Great," Nick muttered. "What's new?" Listen, Nick, Samantha continued, urgency in her voice. Bennett's not just looking for you. He's hunting down anyone connected to you, people you thought were safe. He's moved his operation underground, and he's using your past to track you. They're digging up everything. People from your old cases, the ones you thought were closed. You need to get out of the city. Fast. Lila looked at Nick, who was still listening intently, his face darkening as Samantha's words sank in. We've already made plans, Sam, Nick said through gritted teeth. What's the deal with my contact at the station? Do they have anything? Samantha hesitated, a long pause on the other end of the line. I don't know, but there's someone else. Someone you can't trust. Nick froze, his eyes narrowing at the phone. What? Who? There's a leak, Samantha replied. Someone at your news station is feeding Bennett information. The tip-off you got about your contact? It wasn't just coincidence. Someone's been watching you. Lila felt the ground shift beneath her feet. A leak? In the only place they had left to turn for help? Nick cursed under his breath. Damn it, this is worse than I thought. Get out of town, Samantha insisted. Get out now, and don't go back until you've figured out who the traitor is. You don't want to make this worse. Nick hung up, his hand shaking as he lowered the phone from his ear. There's a rat, he muttered, voice low and full of frustration. Someone in my past is feeding Bennett info. We can't trust anyone. Lila's mind raced. This was more complicated than she thought. If Bennett had eyes and ears everywhere, they were running out of time to expose him. But if they couldn't even trust the people who had helped them before, what choice did they have left? There has to be someone, Lila said, her voice strained but determined. Someone who will help us, no matter what. Nick's eyes softened for a brief moment as he looked at her. You really think we can find someone in all this mess? With a mole working against us? Lila held his gaze, her hands tightening into fists. If we don't, we're as good as dead. Nick nodded slowly. He reached over and started the car, the engine roaring to life again. All right, we'll lay low for a bit, but then we make our move. We find out who this mole is, and we turn this around. Lila looked out the window as they drove through the dimly lit streets, her thoughts swirling. Bennett's empire was vast, and they were up against forces they barely understood. But one thing was certain, they couldn't do this alone. We'll need to find new allies, Lila said quietly, the weight of the decision heavy on her shoulders. And we'll need to be careful. Trust is a luxury we don't have anymore. Nick gave her a tight smile, his voice unwavering. Then we make our own luck. We find the truth, and we make sure Bennett doesn't win. As the city faded behind them, Lila knew they were walking a razor-thin line between survival and defeat. But there was no turning back now. With the danger closing in from all sides and an unexpected mole threatening to sabotage their efforts, Lila and Nick must navigate a web of lies, betrayal, and corruption to expose the truth before it's buried forever. The city skyline slowly disappeared into the distance as Nick's car sped down the highway. The night was quiet, save for the occasional hum of the tires against the pavement. Lila sat in silence beside him, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Every passing mile felt like a step deeper into unknown territory, and the uncertainty gnawed at her insides. Nick glanced over at her, his jaw clenched. Where do we go now? Lila's gaze was fixed on the road ahead, but her mind was elsewhere. She had been thinking about Samantha's warning, about the mole. They couldn't trust anyone, and that left them with few options. We need to find someone who knows about Bennett's operations, Lila said, her voice quiet but determined. Someone who's been on the inside. Nick exhaled sharply. You think we can even trust someone like that? If they're that close to him, they might be just as dangerous. I don't think we have much of a choice, Lila replied, her hand tightening around the seatbelt. Bennett's too powerful. We need to figure out where he's hiding, what he's planning, and we need someone who's seen it firsthand. Nick turned off the main highway, steering the car toward a quieter, less traveled road. There's one person I can think of, he said, his voice low. An old informant. But he's not exactly someone we can walk up to and ask for help. He's paranoid, lives off the grid. Lila raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Does he know anything about Bennett? Nick nodded slowly. He knows a lot. But he won't just hand that kind of info over. We'll have to find him and convince him. Lila wasn't sure what that meant, but she didn't argue. If Nick thought this was their best shot, she trusted him. They had no other lead. The car pulled into a small, run-down gas station at the edge of town. The flickering lights barely illuminated the pumps, and the area was eerily deserted. Nick parked in front of the building and turned off the engine. "Stay close," he warned, glancing over at Lila. "This isn't exactly a safe place. We don't know who's watching." Lila nodded, her senses on high alert as they both stepped out of the car. The cold night air hit her face, and she instinctively pulled her jacket tighter around her. They walked toward the small convenience store, the creaking of the wooden door signaling their arrival. Behind the counter stood an older man, his grizzled face hidden behind thick glasses. He didn't look up when they entered, but his eyes flickered briefly toward the door before returning to the magazine he was reading. Lila could tell immediately that he was watching them in the reflection of the glass. Nick leaned over the counter, speaking in a low voice. "You got any idea where Frank is?" The man's hand paused on the page. Slowly, he lifted his gaze to Nick, then to Lila, his expression unreadable. He took a moment, as though deciding whether to speak. "Don't know no Frank," he muttered gruffly, but his eyes flickered again. "But there's a guy out back. You might want to talk to him." Nick didn't miss the subtle shift in the man's demeanor. He nodded slightly, a silent thank you, and turned toward the back door. Lila's instincts were on high alert as they walked through the dimly lit corridor. The door at the end creaked as Nick opened it, revealing a small, cluttered alleyway. A lone figure stood by a rusted metal dumpster, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. The man was older than she expected, mid-50s, with a scruffy beard and a weathered face, his eyes sharp but cautious. "Frank?" Nick called out. The man didn't answer right away. He studied them for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he nodded slightly and stepped forward. His voice was low but direct. "You don't look like the kind of people who need to be here," Frank said, his eyes scanning the alley before returning to Nick. "What do you want?" Nick held his ground. "Information. We need to know everything you've got on Bennett." Frank's face tightened, a flicker of recognition crossing his features. He took a step back, his posture defensive. "Bennett? That's a name I don't speak unless I have to. You're asking for trouble." Lila felt her heart rate spike as she watched Frank carefully. "We're not asking for trouble," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We're trying to stop a man who's destroying everything in his path. People's lives are at risk. We need to stop him before it's too late." Frank was silent for a moment, his gaze darting between them. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "You think you're the first to try and take him down? Everyone who's tried has disappeared. Bennett's got his fingers in every pie, and I'm not talking about just the city. He's got connections everywhere." Lila exchanged a look with Nick, frustration building. "So, what? You're just going to sit back and let him destroy everything?" Frank scowled, turning away from them for a moment as if weighing his options. "You don't get it. Bennett's not just some local thug. He's got more power than you realize, and messing with him is a death sentence. But if you're serious about this, there's something I know. Something I saw." Lila took a step closer, her voice steady. "What did you see?" Frank hesitated again before he spoke, his words measured. "Bennett's operation isn't just about money or drugs. He's got a plan. A big one. He's moving into something that's going to change everything. But if you want to stop him, you'll need to act fast. And you'll need more than just guts." Nick's gaze hardened, his mind already working through the implications. "We'll do whatever it takes. Tell us what you know." Frank paused, as though deciding whether to trust them. Finally, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He handed it to Nick, his expression grim. "Take this," he said. "It's a start, but you're on your own after that." Nick unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the contents. He looked back at Frank, nodding slowly. "Thanks. This could be the break we need." Lila glanced at the paper in Nick's hands. There was a name on it, a name she recognized from one of the cases Nick had worked on years ago. "This doesn't end here," Lila said, her voice filled with resolve. "We'll find Bennett. and we'll make sure he pays." Frank gave them a long, hard look before turning and disappearing into the shadows. Nick folded the paper and stuffed it into his jacket. Lila looked at him, her determination clear. "We're getting closer. We just need to keep moving." Nick nodded, his jaw tight. "No more running. We find the truth, and we end this." As they made their way back to the car, the weight of the road ahead settled on their shoulders. But there was no turning back now. The fight for survival had only just begun. With a crucial lead in hand, and the stakes higher than ever, Lila and Nick are closer than ever to exposing Bennett's operation. But with the danger intensifying, can they uncover the truth before it's too late? Lila sat in the passenger seat, the map spread across her lap, her fingers tracing the route as they made their way toward the address Frank had given them. The road was long and empty, the kind of place where the night stretched endlessly ahead, with only the headlights to guide them. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of what Frank had told them, about Bennett's plans and how they were only scratching the surface. Nick's hands gripped the wheel, his eyes focused on the road, but there was a tenseness to his posture that Lila recognized. He wasn't the type to let his guard down, not even in a moment like this, when their next step could be the key to bringing everything down. "You think he's telling the truth?" Lila asked, her voice breaking the silence that had hung between them for the last hour. Nick's gaze flickered toward her briefly. "Frank? He wouldn't give us a lead like that unless he thought it was real. The guy's been on the run for years. If he was lying, he wouldn't have put himself at risk." Lila nodded, her mind still spinning. She could feel the weight of their pursuit pressing down on her. This wasn't just about exposing Bennett anymore. It was about stopping him before the damage became irreversible. The car slowed as they approached a dilapidated building at the edge of a small industrial park. A few scattered lights flickered dimly from the upper windows, but the place had the unmistakable feel of abandonment. If this was where the next part of their journey led, they were about to walk into a hornet's nest. Nick parked the car in the shadow of a nearby warehouse, cutting the engine. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with anticipation. "Ready?" he asked, his voice low. Lila didn't hesitate. "I've been ready for this since we started." They stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at their skin. The parking lot was empty, save for a few rusted vehicles and scattered debris. A distant hum from the nearby freeway was the only sound that filled the space. The building ahead loomed, a crumbling shell of what it once was, but Lila knew it wasn't deserted. Frank wouldn't have sent them here if it were. Nick led the way, his eyes scanning the surroundings as they approached the entrance. The door creaked open with a groan, revealing a darkened hallway. Lila's instincts kicked in immediately, her hand instinctively hovering near the sidearm she'd kept hidden under her jacket. They moved cautiously through the building, the smell of mildew and decay filling the air. Their footsteps echoed off the concrete, too loud in the silence. Every corner seemed to hold a secret, and Lila couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Nick gestured to a door at the end of the hallway. "This is it," he murmured. "Be ready." Lila nodded, her breath steady despite the tension gnawing at her. She wasn't afraid, not yet. Not until they saw what lay beyond that door. Nick pushed it open, revealing a small room with a single overhead light. In the center stood a man, his back to them. He was tall, with dark hair, wearing a plain shirt and jeans. He didn't look like much, just another nobody. But something about the way he stood told Lila that he wasn't just another bystander. "Don't move," Nick called out, his voice commanding. The man turned slowly, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of calm. His eyes were calculating, sizing them up, but there was a coldness to them that sent a chill down Lila's spine. "You're here," the man said, his voice smooth, almost disinterested. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Lila's heart skipped a beat. "Who are you?" The man smirked. "Let's just say I'm someone who knows a thing or two about Bennett. And I'm the one who can help you get to him." Nick took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "We don't need help. We need information. You've got 5 seconds to start talking before this goes sideways." The man raised an eyebrow but didn't flinch. "You don't want to go down that road. I'm the key to getting inside Bennett's operation. You need me if you're going to survive." Lila glanced at Nick. He wasn't convinced, But there was no denying that they were at a crossroads. If what this man said was true, he might be the one piece they were missing. But could they trust him? "I'm not here to make friends," the man continued, his voice laced with a hint of amusement. "I'm here to make sure Bennett's plan goes up in flames. You want to stop him, you'll need my help. Otherwise, you're as good as dead." Nick took a breath, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he spoke. "What's your angle? What do you want from us?" The man's eyes glinted in the dim light. "Information. Protection. A seat at the table when Bennett's empire crumbles. That's all I'm asking." Lila didn't like the sound of that. "You're working with Bennett, aren't you?" The man shook his head, his expression turning more serious. "I used to, until I realized the kind of monster he really is. Now I'm playing my own game, and you're going to help me win." Nick studied the man for a long moment before finally lowering his gun. "Fine, but this better be worth it." The man smirked again. "Oh, it will be." Lila crossed her arms, her thoughts racing. This wasn't the kind of alliance she was comfortable with, but she didn't see another choice. Bennett was too powerful, and they needed all the help they could get. "You're not going to regret this," the man said, taking a step forward. "I've got the information you need. But first, I want you to understand one thing. Bennett's operation goes deeper than you think. What he's building, it's going to change everything. And if you don't stop him now, there's no going back." Nick exhaled sharply. "Then let's get to work." The man handed them a folder, thick with documents, photographs, and notes. Lila took it, her fingers brushing over the papers, feeling the weight of what they were about to uncover. "This is just the beginning," the man said cryptically as he turned to leave. "What you do with this information is up to you. But remember, once you open this door, there's no turning back." Lila glanced at Nick. They were standing on the precipice now, and there was no turning back. Bennett's empire was about to come crashing down, whether they were ready for it or not. With a mysterious new ally and crucial intelligence in hand, Lila and Nick stand on the verge of exposing Bennett's operation. But with danger lurking around every corner, can they stay ahead of their enemies? The room was silent as Lila flipped through the contents of the folder, her eyes scanning each page with a growing sense of disbelief. The documents were a maze of names, dates, and locations, but what stood out most were the photographs, images of meetings between Bennett and high-ranking officials, some of whom Lila recognized, others whose faces were unfamiliar but no less menacing. Nick paced behind her, his boots heavy against the concrete floor. He stopped occasionally, glancing over her shoulder, but said nothing. His silence was more telling than anything he could have said aloud. They both knew that what they were looking at could change everything. "This is insane," Lila muttered under her breath, her fingers trembling as she held up one of the photos. It showed Bennett, standing beside a group of military officers, a clandestine exchange in some undisclosed location. The image was grainy, but the tension in their body language was unmistakable. Nick leaned in, his gaze darkening as he studied the photo. "We're talking about more than just business deals. This is military-grade stuff. Weapons, defense contracts. This goes far beyond organized crime." Lila nodded, her throat tight. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became that Bennett wasn't just a criminal mastermind. He was a man with an entire network, one that reached into the highest echelons of power. And they were just beginning to scratch the surface. She flipped through the next few pages, revealing detailed schematics of safe houses, shipping routes, and even a list of government contracts that Bennett's operation had infiltrated. The web was vast, too vast to be taken down easily. "We need to take this to the authorities," Lila said, her voice firm but edged with doubt. "This is bigger than anything we can handle alone." Nick was quiet for a long moment before he spoke. "You really think they'll do something with it? Look at the names on these contracts. Some of them are untouchable." Lila's stomach churned. She'd known for a while that the system was corrupt, but seeing it laid out in front of her like this was another thing entirely. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. They weren't just going up against a criminal empire. They were going up against a system that had been compromised from the inside out. "Then we go to the press," Lila said, her voice gaining strength. "Expose it all." Nick shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "You think the press will take this seriously?" They'll bury it before it even gets off the ground. Lila didn't answer immediately, but she knew he was right. The people in power had too much to lose, and they would go to any lengths to protect their interests. The press might not be the answer. But then what? Then we go to the source, Lila said, more to herself than to Nick. We find out who's really behind this and take them down. Nick's gaze sharpened. You're talking about Bennett. You think we can get to him? Lila stood up, closing the folder with a decisive snap. If we don't, then everything we've uncovered will be for nothing. The man who had handed them the folder had said they were in too deep, that there would be no turning back once they knew what Bennett was capable of. And now, standing in the shadow of that truth, Lila couldn't ignore the path that lay ahead. It was a dangerous one, filled with enemies on all sides, but it was the only way forward. Let's take a look at these locations, she said, scanning the remaining documents. There's got to be something here that can lead us straight to him. Nick nodded, moving to her side and peering over her shoulder at the maps. They were dotted with pins marking various sites, warehouses, private estates, and a handful of buildings that didn't even appear on official maps. There was no telling which one might hold the answers they needed, but the odds were high that they'd have to visit every single one of them to find out. Lila felt her pulse quicken as she studied the locations. These aren't just hideouts. These are strategic points, places that are connected. If we hit one of them, we might get closer to him. But we need to move fast. Bennett won't sit idle while we're digging into his business. Nick stood, his jaw clenched. We need a plan, and we need it now. We can't just start storming places on a hunch. Lila nodded. We start small, one location at a time. We get in, get what we need, and get out. No mistakes. Nick looked at her, his expression unreadable. You're willing to risk everything for this? For some names on paper? Lila met his gaze without flinching. I don't have a choice anymore. This isn't just about Bennett. It's about everything he's built, everything he's taken. People's lives are at stake. The room was quiet again, but this time, the silence wasn't heavy with uncertainty. It was full of resolve. Let's do this, Nick said, his voice firm. Lila exhaled slowly, steeling herself for what came next. She had no illusions about the dangers they were walking into. There was no turning back now, not with the stakes as high as they were. But the truth was out there, and they were the ones who were going to find it. Lila and Nick prepare for their first strike against Bennett's sprawling operation. With their target in sight, they face a dangerous road ahead. Can they uncover the heart of Bennett's empire before it's too late? The cold night air cut through Lila's jacket as she and Nick approached the warehouse, their footsteps muffled by the gravel underfoot. The location was one of the ones they'd flagged, a remote, industrial area on the outskirts of town. No neighbors for miles, just rows of empty buildings that had once housed thriving businesses. Now, they were nothing more than shells, perfect places to hide, to operate under the radar. Lila checked the time on her phone, 2:30 a.m. They had chosen this time for a reason. No one expected trouble at this hour, and if Bennett's men were on site, they'd be at their weakest. There was no turning back now. You ready? Nick's voice broke the silence, low and steady. His tone gave nothing away, but Lila could tell that he was just as aware of the stakes as she was. Lila nodded, pulling the hood of her jacket over her head and tightening the straps of her gloves. The night was their ally, but only if they moved quickly and silently. She glanced at Nick, who was already checking his equipment, night vision goggles, a small flashlight, a few tools. It was a simple operation. Get in, gather intel, and get out. But nothing about this felt simple anymore. Let's move, she whispered. They approached the warehouse cautiously, staying in the shadows. The place was dark, save for a faint light leaking from one of the windows. The door was locked, but Lila wasn't surprised. They'd been expecting that. Nick had already come prepared with a lockpicking kit. In seconds, the door clicked open. They slipped inside, the heavy steel door closing behind them with a quiet thud. The interior was cold, the air thick with dust. Rows of crates were stacked along the walls, some marked with foreign labels, others bearing no identifiers at all. It didn't take a detective to guess what they might be storing. Keep your eyes open, Lila murmured, her voice barely audible as she took the lead. This is the kind of place they'll use to store weapons, or worse. Nick moved beside her, his eyes scanning the area, his hand instinctively resting on the grip of his gun. Every corner was a potential threat. Every shadow could hide a person or a camera. They had to be careful. They moved through the warehouse in silence, their steps calculated, avoiding the few scattered beams of light. Lila led them down a narrow hallway toward the back, where she knew there was a door to a second, smaller room. The blueprints they had uncovered had marked it as a high-security area, probably where the real secrets were kept. The door was slightly ajar, a small gap of light spilling out. Lila's heart rate picked up. This was it, the place that could give them the edge they needed. She turned to Nick, motioning for him to cover the rear while she checked inside. Her hand rested on the handle, but she hesitated for a split second. There was always a risk when entering unknown territory, but there was no turning back now. With a swift push, the door opened. Inside, the room was cluttered with electronic equipment, monitors displaying grainy footage, and rows of filing cabinets. But what caught Lila's eye was the large steel safe in the corner. Its door slightly ajar, revealing a mess of documents spilling out. It looked like someone had been in a hurry. "Nick," Lila whispered, "I think we found what we need." Nick stepped forward, eyes scanning the room. "Are we sure this is the right place?" Lila moved to the safe, carefully pulling out a handful of documents. The contents were just as damning as what they had seen earlier. Contracts, transaction records, and even more photographs of meetings between Bennett and various high-level officials. But there was something new this time. A series of encrypted messages, likely detailing future plans and transactions. "This is it," Lila said, her voice tense with excitement. "This is the proof we need." Nick nodded, already gathering the papers. "We need to get out of here now." But before they could make a move, a sound echoed through the warehouse. A sharp click of a door opening. The hair on the back of Lila's neck stood on end. They weren't alone anymore. Lila's eyes darted around the room, but there was nowhere to hide. They had no choice but to move fast. She motioned for Nick to follow her as they bolted for the exit, but just as they reached the hallway, a figure appeared in the doorway. One of Bennett's men, tall and broad-shouldered, blocking their way. "Going somewhere?" the man sneered, pulling a gun from his waistband. Lila's mind raced. They had no time to fight, no time for anything but getting out. She reached for her own gun, but Nick was faster. Without a word, he shot a stun gun at the man's chest, the electric charge sending him crashing to the ground in a heap. "Move," Nick hissed, grabbing Lila's arm and pulling her toward the exit. They ran, not looking back, their hearts pounding in their chests. The warehouse was eerily silent now, but they knew better than to think they were safe. The moment they stepped into the open, it would all come crashing down. They burst out into the night, their footsteps heavy as they made their way toward the car. Lila's breath came in ragged gasps as she fumbled for the keys. The documents were safe for now, but they had just stirred the hornet's nest. Bennett's men would be after them, and there would be no more hiding in the shadows. But the truth was out there. They were closer than ever to exposing Bennett, and they couldn't afford to stop now. Lila and Nick barely escape with the intel they need. The heat is on, and they must now figure out how to use the information before Bennett's empire closes in on them. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the empty streets as Lila and Nick sat in the car, parked in an alley several blocks from the warehouse. The engine was off, the interior dark and still, but both of them were wide awake. Lila couldn't shake the feeling of urgency gnawing at her insides. They'd made it out barely, but now they had to figure out their next move. The documents Nick had stashed beside him were their ticket to taking down Bennett, but she knew that the road ahead was about to get much darker. She glanced over at Nick, his fingers drumming nervously on the steering wheel. He was usually calm in a crisis, but tonight had rattled him. She could see it in his eyes. There was more at stake now than just their lives. "We can't go back to the office," Lila said, breaking the silence. "Not yet. If Bennett has eyes on us, we're as good as dead." Nick nodded, his jaw set in a grim line. "So, what now? We go underground?" Lila thought for a moment. It was risky, but they had no choice. If Bennett's men found them before they could share the intel, they'd be right back where they started. Worse, they'd be handing over the evidence they had uncovered. We need to get this stuff to someone who can protect it. Someone higher up, Lila said, her eyes narrowing as she stared out the windshield. Maybe it's time we go to the press? Nick looked at her, disbelief flashing across his face. The press? You know what Bennett's capable of. He won't hesitate to bury us, literally, if we go public with this. I know, but if we don't do it now, we're not going to have another chance, Lila said, her voice steady but urgent. We're not just dealing with Bennett. We're up against an entire system. If we wait too long, we'll lose the upper hand. Nick exhaled slowly, his fingers gripping the wheel tighter. You're right, but who do we trust? Lila hesitated. Trust was a luxury they didn't have. But there was one name she'd been holding on to, someone who had the reach and resources to make sure the story got out. A reporter, Kayla Vargas. She had been sniffing around Bennett for months, digging up dirt on his operations. The last time Lila had seen her, she'd hinted that she had more on the man than anyone realized. Kayla might be the only person who could help them expose Bennett and survive the fallout. I know a reporter, Lila said, her voice quieter now, more determined. She's been after Bennett for a while. If we can get the information to her, she'll know what to do with it. Nick was silent for a moment, processing what she said. He didn't like the idea of trusting anyone, especially someone on the outside, but he knew it was their best shot. Where do we find her? He asked, his voice low. Lila pulled out her phone and searched through her contacts, scrolling until she found the number she was looking for. She hesitated, her finger hovering over the screen. The risk was immense. If they were wrong about Kayla, or if Bennett had eyes on her, it could spell disaster. But there was no time to second-guess. Lila pressed the call button. The phone rang several times before a voice answered, sharp and alert. Lila? This is Kayla. Kayla, it's Lila, Lila said, keeping her voice even. We've got something for you. Something big. We need to meet. Now. There was a brief pause on the other end, then Kayla's voice, tight with suspicion. What's going on? I thought you were lying low. We don't have much time. It's about Bennett. We've got documents, proof of his operation, but we need to get it to someone who can protect it, Lila said quickly. Can we trust you? Kayla didn't answer right away. Lila could hear the sound of rustling papers in the background, the rapid clicking of keys. Then Kayla's voice came through, low and measured. You know I've been trying to bring Bennett down for months. You bring me something solid, and I'll make sure it gets out. But you're right, it's not safe. I've got a place we can meet. Where are you? Lila glanced at Nick, who was watching her, waiting for an answer. We'll be there in 20 minutes. You trust no one, understand? Got it. See you soon, Kayla said, and hung up. Lila turned to Nick, her heart pounding. It's risky, but it's our only shot. Nick nodded, his face hardening. Let's move. The drive to the meeting point was tense, the city streets growing emptier as they left the crowded downtown area. They followed Kayla's instructions, pulling into a narrow alley behind a small coffee shop. The place looked innocuous, nothing more than a quiet corner in an otherwise bustling neighborhood. Nick parked the car and turned off the engine. You sure about this? He asked, his gaze searching hers. Lila took a deep breath. We don't have another choice. They got out of the car, moving cautiously toward the back entrance of the shop. It was dark, but Lila could see the faint outline of Kayla standing near the door, a figure silhouetted against the dim light spilling from inside. Lila, Kayla greeted them, her voice low but steady. Nick, glad you made it. I've been waiting for you. Without waiting for an invitation, she stepped aside and motioned for them to enter. Lila and Nick followed her inside, the door clicking shut behind them. The interior was small and cozy, the smell of freshly brewed coffee mingling with the faint scent of old wood. Kayla led them to a table in the back corner, where she had already set up a laptop and several files. Lila didn't waste time. She slid the folder containing the documents across the table toward Kayla, her eyes locking onto the reporter's face. This is everything we have. If we don't act fast, Bennett's men will catch up to us. We need to go public now. Kayla flipped through the papers quickly, her eyes scanning each one with practiced precision. She didn't flinch at the damning evidence. It was clear that she had been expecting something like this. After a moment, she looked up at them, her expression tight. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. "Once I run with this, there's no turning back. Bennett won't just let you walk away." Lila met her gaze, her voice firm. "We don't have a choice. He's been running things for too long. It's time to expose him." Kayla nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "All right, I'll get this out fast, but we'll have to stay ahead of him. You won't be safe for much longer." Lila and Nick exchanged a look, both understanding the weight of what was about to happen. There was no turning back now. As Kayla began to type rapidly on her laptop, preparing the first wave of stories, Lila could only hope they had done enough to take down Bennett before he realized they were coming for him. The air felt heavier now, suffocating with each passing minute. Lila and Nick sat in the small, dimly lit back room of the coffee shop, watching Kayla as she worked quickly at the laptop. The tap of keys echoed in the silence, punctuating the urgency of their situation. Kayla was good. No one could deny that. She'd been in this game long enough to know how to move fast without drawing attention. But Lila couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. "Do you think it'll be enough?" Nick asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lila didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on Kayla's screen, watching as the reporter compiled the data into a form ready to send. "It has to be. The truth will be out there. It's the only thing that can stop him." Nick leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. "Yeah, but it won't be just Bennett coming after us once this goes public. We're talking about a whole system that's built around him. He's not alone in this." Lila's thoughts raced. Nick was right. They weren't just up against Bennett. They were up against an entire network of people who had been benefiting from his corruption for years. People with money, power, and the will to silence anyone who stood in their way. Before she could respond, Kayla's voice broke through the tension. "It's done. The first article's up. It's already gaining traction." Lila and Nick exchanged a look. It was happening. The story was out there. Bennett wouldn't be able to ignore it for long. Kayla leaned back in her chair, stretching her arms over her head. "Now we just wait." Lila couldn't wait. She could feel the storm closing in, the walls getting smaller with every second. They'd made their move, but now the consequences were starting to unfold. As they sat there in the quiet aftermath, the door to the coffee shop suddenly swung open. A chill ran through Lila as a figure stepped inside, their silhouette barely visible in the low light. It was too soon. There was no way they'd been found this fast. Nick's hand moved instinctively to the inside of his jacket, where he kept his gun, but Lila stopped him with a barely perceptible shake of her head. They couldn't afford to make a scene. Kayla, however, stood up immediately, her eyes locking onto the newcomer. Lila could feel the tension in the air as the figure moved toward their table, slowly but with purpose. It was a man, tall, wearing a dark coat and a hat that obscured most of his face. He didn't seem to be in a rush, but the air around him was thick with danger. "You're late," Kayla said, her voice calm but wary. The man didn't respond immediately. He pulled a chair out and sat down across from her, his gaze shifting between Lila and Nick. "I was told to meet you here." Lila's pulse quickened. This was bad. The last thing they needed was someone else coming in to complicate the situation. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice sharp. She had no patience for games right now. The man finally looked directly at her. His eyes were cold, calculating. "I'm here on behalf of someone who has an interest in your story. Someone who believes it's worth more than just a few headlines." Kayla's expression flickered for just a second. Concern, maybe, before she masked it. "Who?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small envelope, sliding it across the table to Kayla. The man's eyes never left her, studying her every move. Kayla hesitated, then opened the envelope, pulling out a single sheet of paper. She read it quickly, her expression unreadable. Lila leaned forward, her instincts telling her to be ready for anything. Nick had already positioned himself, his eyes on the door. "What is this?" Kayla finally asked, her voice strained. The man smirked. "An offer. Your story can be bigger than you think, but it'll cost you." Kayla looked up, her eyes narrowing. "I don't deal in extortion." The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. No one's asking you to. But your story could disappear, along with everything you've worked for, if you don't play your cards right. Lila felt a chill creep down her spine. It was a threat, not just against Kayla, but against all of them. The man stood up, slowly, carefully. Think it over, but don't take too long. He turned to leave, but then paused at the door. And just so you know, Bennett's people are already looking for you. They know you've gone to ground. Lila's breath caught in her throat. This was worse than they thought. The door clicked shut behind him, and for a moment, no one spoke. Lila could feel the weight of what was unfolding. Kayla set the letter down on the table, her fingers lingering over the edges. This just got a hell of a lot more complicated. Nick stood up, his voice low. That wasn't just some messenger. That was someone sent by Bennett's people. Lila nodded. We're in deeper than we realized. Kayla's eyes flicked back to Lila and Nick, her gaze hardening. So, what now? Are we running, or do we fight back? Lila stood, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. We don't run. Kayla met her gaze, and for the first time since they'd walked in, there was a hint of understanding between them. Then let's get to work. The night dragged on as they made their plans. It was clear that the clock was ticking. Bennett was coming for them, but Lila wasn't about to let him win. Not after everything they'd sacrificed. Not after everything they'd uncovered. She had no illusions about what was at stake. This wasn't just about taking down a corrupt businessman. This was about bringing down an entire system, one that had turned a blind eye to the suffering of so many. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be pretty, but it had to be done. And if Bennett thought he could bury them, he was about to learn that the truth had a way of rising to the surface, no matter how deep he tried to bury it. The stakes get higher as threats from Bennett's camp loom closer, and Lila and her team must decide if they'll fight or flee. The days that followed felt like they were slipping through Lila's fingers. Every move, every step, felt calculated and deliberate, as if they were being watched from every angle. The weight of the decision to press forward, to fight against Bennett and the corrupt system he controlled, bore heavily on her shoulders. But there was no turning back now. The first wave of backlash had arrived faster than expected. Kayla's article had stirred the pot, drawing attention, but it also invited the kind of heat they couldn't ignore. The threats, the messages, the constant feeling of being hunted. It was all part of the game now. But this time, they were the ones on the offensive. Lila paced the small apartment she and Nick had been using as a base of operations. Kayla had gone underground again, staying off the grid as much as possible while they worked on getting more stories out there. Each one was a small but significant strike against Bennett's empire. Nick had been quiet for hours, his focus fixed on his phone, scanning for any signs of activity. He didn't need to say it. Lila could feel the tension between them, the pressure of knowing they were in the fight of their lives. What's the next move? Lila asked, breaking the silence. Nick didn't look up from his screen. I've been tracking Bennett's people. They're tightening the net, and they're getting closer. I've managed to intercept some of their comms. Nothing concrete yet, but they're not being subtle anymore. Lila's eyes narrowed. She could almost feel the danger, like a storm cloud looming just on the horizon. How much time do we have? Hard to say. It depends on how fast they move. But they're looking for us, and they're getting desperate. Nick's voice was low, calculating. We might have one shot left at getting to Bennett directly before his people find us. Lila thought for a moment. She had no illusions about how risky this was. Going straight after Bennett was the kind of move that could end everything. Their investigation, their lives, and the small shred of hope they still had for exposing the truth. But it was also their only chance. She nodded. Then we take it. We need to hit him where it hurts. His connections, his money, his reputation. We go public with everything. Nick met her eyes, his expression grim. And if that doesn't work? Lila paused. Then we make sure they can't ignore us. They didn't have much time to plan. The more they delayed, the higher the chance that Bennett's network would close in on them. But they needed something more, a key piece that would tie everything together and prove that Bennett wasn't just a businessman. He was the linchpin of a far-reaching corruption machine. That night, as they met in the small, cramped room at the coffee shop, the plan was set in motion. Kayla had gathered the final bits of evidence, and now it was time to push it all to the public. "Are you sure about this?" Kayla asked, her voice filled with a quiet determination. "Once we go live with this, there's no taking it back." Lila looked at her, her jaw set in defiance. "I'm sure. We've got the facts. We've got the proof. And we've got a story that needs to be told." Kayla gave a nod, her fingers moving quickly over the keyboard. The article was nearly done, a culmination of weeks of research, interviews, and hidden documents. It wasn't just about exposing Bennett anymore. It was about revealing the truth that had been buried for so long. The crooked deals, the bribed officials, the blackmail, and the bodies buried under the weight of it all. The article was the kind of bombshell that could shift the entire landscape, but it was also the kind of story that would make them public enemy number one. They were taking their last stand. The moment Kayla hit send, Lila's heart pounded in her chest. The article was live, and there was no turning back. For a brief moment, the room was still. Then the notifications began to flood in, messages, alerts, and comments. It wasn't just the people who had been following their investigation. This story had gone global. The media picked it up faster than Lila had expected. It was the kind of exposure Bennett couldn't ignore. "Here we go," Nick muttered, his eyes glued to his phone. "They're coming for us." But they weren't the only ones watching. Lila's phone buzzed. A message from an unrecognized number. "We're watching. You won't get away with this." Lila clenched her fists, rage simmering beneath her skin. She had expected the threats, but seeing them in black and white made it real. She wasn't afraid. Not anymore. The people had the truth now, and once the truth was out, there was no going back for Bennett or his allies. "This is it," Kayla said, standing up from the desk. "It's out there now. No more hiding." Lila turned to face her team, her gaze hardening. "They won't be able to ignore us. Not after this." Nick didn't flinch. "We'll be ready, but it's time to get moving. We've got to make sure Bennett can't destroy what we've done." They all knew what was at stake. This wasn't just about justice, it was about survival. As they prepared to leave the coffee shop, Lila felt the weight of the world pressing down on her. There was no telling how far Bennett would go to silence them. He had the resources, the power, and the ruthlessness to take them down. But there was something Bennett had never counted on. The resolve of people who had nothing left to lose. And Lila wasn't about to let that truth be buried. They walked out into the night, ready for whatever came next. They had drawn the line. Now, it was time to cross it. With the story now public, Lila and her team brace for the backlash. The game has changed, and they've made their stand. But will it be enough to topple Bennett? The following days were a blur of phone calls, emails, and nonstop messages. The article had gone viral, the story of Bennett's empire of corruption sprawling across every media outlet. They had done it. They had brought the truth to light. But with every piece of information that spread, the danger grew. The threats had escalated from vague warnings to explicit plans of retaliation. Bennett wasn't going to let this slide. Not without a fight. Lila sat in the dimly lit office, the glow of her laptop illuminating her tired face. Kayla had been up all night, combing through the response to the article. The impact was undeniable. The public was in an uproar, social media had erupted in outrage, and the stories were being shared faster than anyone could process. But Bennett's influence was vast. He had people everywhere, politicians, law enforcement, even in the media. It was only a matter of time before he made his move. "We've done our part," Kayla said, looking up from her phone. "But Bennett's not just going to roll over. He's going to retaliate, and he's going to come hard." Lila exhaled, leaning back in her chair. "I know, but we can't back down now. We've gone too far." Nick, who had been silent for most of the morning, finally spoke. "I'm tracking movement on his end. He's circling. His people are mobilizing." Lila's eyes flicked toward him. "What does that mean?" "It means we need to move, and we need to move fast," he replied, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "If we're going to take him down, we can't afford to wait around." Lila's mind raced. What could they do to push this forward while also staying one step ahead of Bennett? It was one thing to expose the truth. It was another to make sure it didn't get buried under the weight of his power. Her phone buzzed on the desk, breaking her train of thought. She glanced at the screen. "Meet me at the safe house. It's time to move." It was from an anonymous source. The safe house was their last line of defense. It was where they could regroup, lay low, and plan their next move without the ever-present fear of being found. "Who is it?" Kayla asked, her tone sharp. Lila hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "A contact. They say it's time to move." Nick gave a grim nod. "Then we go. No second-guessing." The three of them gathered their things quickly. The urgency was clear. Bennett was no longer just a shadow on the horizon. He was already closing in, and they needed to get ahead of him. The safe house was tucked away in a quiet, nondescript neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't much, just a small, two-story house that blended in with the others on the block. But it had been a haven for many who had risked everything in the fight against corruption. It was where they could disappear for a while. As Lila stepped out into the night, the weight of what they were about to do settled in her chest. She had taken a stand. But this next phase wasn't about exposing the truth. It was about survival. The story had reached the point of no return, and Bennett would stop at nothing to silence them. The ride to the safe house was quiet. Each of them seemed lost in thought, mentally preparing for whatever was to come. Lila knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. They had to keep pushing forward, keep the pressure on Bennett, or all of this would be for nothing. When they arrived, the door was already open, and their contact, a man named Lucas who had been helping them with logistics, was waiting for them inside. "Glad you made it," he said, his voice low. "You're going to need this." He handed Lila a thick folder, the contents carefully sealed. "This is everything you need to bring him down." Lila looked at the folder, her heart racing. She opened it cautiously, scanning the pages. It was a new set of documents, more damning evidence of Bennett's illegal activities. Bank records, secret communications, transactions that connected him to a wider network of criminals. "This is it," she murmured, her fingers running over the documents. "This is the nail in the coffin." "Exactly," Lucas said. "But there's more. Bennett's network has been trying to cover its tracks. They've already moved some of the key players. You've got to act quickly before they vanish." Kayla looked up from the documents, her eyes sharp. "How do we make this count? How do we make sure he doesn't get away again?" "We take it to the top," Lucas said. "We go straight to the media, to the authorities. But we do it smart. We can't just throw everything out there. We need to be strategic." Lila knew he was right. They had one chance to take Bennett down. If they moved too fast, if they exposed everything all at once, it could all backfire. But if they played their cards right, they could cripple Bennett's empire and bring him to justice. "I'll contact the press," Kayla said, already reaching for her phone. "I'll leak the documents, but we'll do it with a plan. We won't just make it public. We'll make it impossible to ignore." Nick nodded. "And I'll be monitoring Bennett's movements. We can't let him get too far ahead." Lila looked at them both, a sense of resolve settling over her. "Then let's do this. We bring him down, or we don't come back at all." They spent the rest of the night strategizing, going over every detail, ensuring that no stone was left unturned. But as dawn broke, Lila knew they were ready. They had one shot left, and they weren't going to miss it. As they stepped out of the safe house, the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees. The calm before the storm had passed. Now, the real battle was about to begin. Lila and her team are ready to launch their final move against Bennett, armed with evidence that could take him down. But the stakes have never been higher, and Bennett's retaliation is imminent. Can they make it to the finish line before he strikes back? The tension in the air was palpable as Lila sat in the back of the car, her fingers drumming nervously on the folder she'd just been handed. It felt like the calm before a storm. The silence stretched thin with anticipation. Every minute that passed made the world outside feel more distant, more dangerous. Nick was driving, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. Kayla was on the phone, her voice low but intense as she arranged the logistics for the media drop. They'd spent the last few hours solidifying their plan, making sure every angle was covered. No one could afford to slip up, not now. Lila kept her eyes on the road, her mind running through the sequence of events. They were heading to a secure drop point, a place where they could send the documents to the press, to the authorities, and where they could activate the final pieces of their strategy. The documents, The evidence they'd uncovered would be the smoking gun that would unravel Bennett's empire. But they weren't just taking down a businessman. Bennett was no ordinary criminal. He was a monster with far-reaching hands, and every moment they hesitated meant more lives at risk. "Everything's set," Kayla said, hanging up the phone and turning to face Lila. Her eyes were sharp, but Lila could see the fatigue behind them. They had pushed their limits, worked long hours, and now they were running on fumes. "We're just waiting for the green light. How long until it goes public?" Lila asked, her voice steady despite the nervous knot in her stomach. "Once we get the signal, we go live. Media outlets, law enforcement, everyone will have access to the files at once. It'll be impossible for Bennett to cover up." Nick glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "It'll hit him hard, but we need to be ready for retaliation. He's not just going to roll over." Lila nodded, biting her lip. They had no illusions about what was coming. Bennett had too much power, too many connections. If he wanted to silence them, he would do whatever it took. Minutes later, they arrived at the drop point, a small, unmarked building on the outskirts of the city. It was one of their many safe houses, a place no one would expect. As they got out of the car, Lucas was waiting for them at the entrance. "Everything's ready?" Lila asked, her eyes scanning the surroundings. The streets were empty, the city around them quiet in the early morning haze. But she knew it was only a matter of time before everything exploded. Lucas gave a brief nod, leading them inside. The building was sparse. No windows, no signs of life, but it was secure. Lila could feel the weight of the moment pressing on her shoulders as they made their way to the back room, where the operation would go down. "Once we hit send, there's no turning back," Lucas said, his voice grim. "You sure you want to do this?" Lila exchanged a glance with Nick and Kayla. "There's no other choice. We do it now, or Bennett wins." The room was small, but the computers were state-of-the-art. Lucas had already set up the files, the documents ready for dissemination. All they needed was to press a button, and the world would know the truth. Kayla stepped forward, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "On my count." Lila took a deep breath, her heart racing. This was it, the point of no return. Bennett's empire was about to crumble, but the question was, would they make it out of this alive? 3, Kayla said. 2. Lila's mind flashed to all the faces they had met along the way, all the people whose lives had been destroyed by Bennett's greed, the families who had lost everything, the children who had suffered because of the corruption they had uncovered. 1. Kayla hit the key, and the documents were out in the world. It was done. The media had them. The authorities had them. Bennett's darkest secrets were no longer just whispers. They were now public knowledge. For a moment, everything was silent. Lila stood there, her hands shaking slightly, waiting for the storm to break. And then it did. Her phone buzzed. Then another. And another. Kayla's phone rang, and she answered immediately. "This is Kayla. What's the situation?" Lila looked around the room. The tension had shifted from anticipation to immediate danger. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. Lucas turned to them. "They'll be coming for you. I'll take care of the cleanup here. You need to get out of the city now." Lila's eyes widened. "What do you mean, get out?" "We're not. You don't have time. Bennett will move quickly. You need to go, and you need to go now." There was no arguing with him. They had crossed a line that Bennett couldn't ignore. And now, the clock was ticking. Kayla grabbed her bag, and Nick was already halfway to the door. "Let's go. We can't waste any time." The three of them ran to the car, the urgency of the situation clear. Lila glanced over her shoulder. She didn't know if this would be the last time she saw the safe house, or if they'd make it out alive. As Nick sped down the empty streets, the world outside seemed to blur by. But Lila's mind was laser-focused on what came next. They had exposed Bennett's empire, but the fight was far from over. The game had changed, and now it was a race against time to survive. Lila, Kayla, and Nick have exposed Bennett's criminal empire to the world, but the danger has only just begun. Bennett won't let this stand without retaliation. Can they escape his reach long enough to make sure their victory isn't short-lived? The night had fallen heavy and fast, blanketing the city with an almost unnatural stillness. The car's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but shadows and the occasional streetlight that flickered like a dying pulse. Lila's hands gripped the edge of the seat, her body tense as every moment felt like a countdown to something dangerous, something inevitable. Nick was driving with sharp focus, eyes scanning every mirror, every intersection. His jaw was set, his knuckles tight on the wheel. Kayla, in the passenger seat, was silent, her phone still glued to her ear. She was listening to the chaos unfolding across the city, hearing reports from their contacts in the press, the authorities, and from those still working behind the scenes to keep the fallout under control. "We've got a breach," Kayla muttered into the phone, her voice steady despite the chaos on the other end. "We're not safe for long." Lila's stomach tightened. She had always known this moment would come, when the truth would be exposed and their lives would be at risk. But now that it was here, the reality of it hit harder than she expected. Bennett wouldn't let this go. He had too much to lose, and power, as they both knew too well, made people dangerous. "Where do we go from here?" Lila asked, trying to steady the tremor in her voice. "We need to get to the safe house fast," Nick said. "It's the only place we'll have a fighting chance." The words felt hollow. A safe house meant nothing if it wasn't truly safe. And for the first time in a long time, Lila doubted if there was anywhere they could hide that would keep Bennett's men off their trail. But she didn't have a choice. Their only option was to keep moving. She checked her phone, scanning the barrage of notifications. The media had already picked up the story. Headlines were blaring across every news outlet. Social media was exploding with reactions. The whole world knew what Bennett had done now. But as Kayla had said, that didn't mean they were safe. Far from it. "Look out!" Kayla shouted, grabbing the edge of the dashboard. Nick swerved violently, the car screeching as he narrowly avoided a black SUV that had just appeared out of nowhere, its headlights cutting across the road like a predator's eyes. It was too close, too fast. Lila's heart jumped to her throat. She turned around in her seat to see the SUV tailing them. The vehicle was like a shadow, merging with the darkness, but Lila could still make out its sleek outline behind them. "They're on us," Nick said, his voice grim. "Hang on." The car shot forward, the engine roaring to life as they veered onto a side street, narrowly avoiding a head-on collision with another vehicle. The chase had begun. The adrenaline surged through Lila's veins, her focus sharpening even as her body screamed for calm. She could hear the tires screeching as the SUV followed them, staying dangerously close, like a predator stalking its prey. The tension in the air was suffocating. "Kayla, get to the comms. Let's see if we can block their signal," Lila said, already scanning for their next move. Kayla nodded, her fingers flying across her phone's screen. "I'm on it, but we need to lose them first." Nick pushed the car faster, weaving through traffic, cutting corners with reckless precision. The streets blurred past them, but the SUV remained relentless, gaining ground. It was only a matter of time before they were trapped. "Hold on," Nick shouted, jerking the wheel hard to the left. The car slid into a narrow alley, its tires skidding against the rough pavement. Lila's breath caught in her throat as they shot through the alley, barely avoiding the metal dumpsters and stacked boxes that littered the space. The car's side mirror scraped against a concrete wall, sending sparks flying, but they didn't slow down. Behind them, the SUV followed, the sound of its engine reverberating through the alley like a thunderstorm. The gap between them was closing, fast. "Nick, we need a plan," Lila said urgently, her eyes darting around, trying to find an escape. "I've got one," Nick said with a grim smile, his hands tightening on the wheel. "Hang on to something." The alley opened up into a wider street, and without hesitation, Nick swung the car onto the opposite side of the road, forcing another car to slam on its brakes. The SUV followed suit, but the hesitation cost them precious seconds. That's all Nick needed. He swerved again, this time cutting through a narrow opening between two buildings. The car's tires scraped against the stone, the sound deafening, but they made it through. For a moment, they were in the clear. But only for a moment. "We've got a tail," Kayla said, her voice low but sharp as she looked out the back window. Two more cars coming from the other side. "We're surrounded." Lila's stomach turned. They had to do something, anything, to break free. "Nick, I need you to lose them," she said, her voice steady despite the fear curling in her gut. "I'm trying," he gritted out, his gaze locked on the road ahead. He veered off onto another street, taking the car through tighter turns, pushing it to its limits. They needed a miracle, and fast. Just as the first of the two cars closing in on them swerved around a corner, a flash of red and blue lights suddenly lit up the night. Lila's heart skipped a beat. Was it the police? Could it be? But as the sirens blared louder and closer, she realized it wasn't a coincidence. The authorities were here, but were they on their side? Or were they working for Bennett? A deep voice crackled through her phone. "Get out of the car. Now." The words were sharp, authoritative, cold. Lila's blood ran cold. Was this the end? The chase is on, and just when it seemed like they might escape, the unexpected arrival of law enforcement leaves Lila and the team wondering. Are they being saved or hunted? The car screeched to a halt as the flashing lights of the police vehicles lit up the streets, bathing everything in a garish, oppressive glow. Nick's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, then to Lila, his expression unreadable. "We don't stop," he muttered under his breath, his hands tightening on the wheel again, as though preparing to race forward once more. But Lila was already moving, reaching for the door handle. "We can't outrun the law forever. We need to see who's behind this." Kayla's face twisted into a grimace as she glanced at the police cars closing in from the rear. "You sure that's a good idea?" Lila didn't have an answer for that. Every instinct screamed to keep driving, to push harder, faster, farther from the danger. But the situation had shifted. The sirens weren't just a warning now. They were a signal that their options were narrowing and fast. "We don't have much time," Lila said, her voice steady, but the fear she felt gnawed at her insides. "We need to play this carefully." Nick exhaled sharply, then pulled the car to the side of the road. He kept his hands on the wheel, his eyes locked forward, his jaw clenched tight. The decision to stop wasn't one he made lightly, but it was the only move left. The first police cruiser slid to a stop beside them, its sirens blaring in their ears. The doors swung open, and a tall officer stepped out, his uniform crisply pressed, his expression stern. "Out of the car, now," the officer commanded, his voice booming. Lila held her breath, exchanging a glance with Nick. His knuckles were white on the wheel, but he was still watching, waiting. A bead of sweat traced its way down the side of his face. "Do you know who you're dealing with?" Lila asked calmly, keeping her voice level. "We need to get to a safe location. Now." The officer's gaze hardened. He was in no mood for negotiation. "Step out of the car, or we'll make you." Before Lila could respond, two more police vehicles pulled up, blocking them in from the front and the rear. It was clear they were outnumbered, and there was no escape by speed alone. Kayla shifted in her seat, eyes narrowing as she whispered to Lila, "This doesn't feel right." "I know," Lila murmured, her mind racing. There was something off about this whole setup. This wasn't just an ordinary police action. The timing was too precise. The cars too well positioned. They were being herded, and it felt too controlled to be a coincidence. Another officer appeared on the other side of the car. His face was familiar. It was Officer Hernandez, the same one who had been investigating the suspicious deaths tied to Bennett's operations. His eyes met Lila's, and for a brief moment, she saw something. Something more than just the cold professionalism of a cop. There was hesitation there, a flicker of uncertainty. "Step out, Miss Walker," Hernandez said, his voice softer now. "We're not your enemies, but this situation's more complicated than you think." Lila didn't move. She could feel the tension thick in the air, suffocating. She couldn't trust Hernandez. Not yet. But the possibility that he might be on their side flickered just long enough for her to hesitate. Could he be trying to warn them? "What's the play, Nick?" she asked in a low voice, never taking her eyes off Hernandez. Nick didn't answer at first. He was scanning the streets, his eyes darting from one police car to another, as if looking for a way out, or perhaps looking for signs that they weren't entirely alone in this. A long pause hung between them. Then, Nick's voice was quiet but firm. "We stay in the car. I don't trust them." Lila's heartbeat pounded in her chest, the air suddenly heavy with 1,000 possible outcomes. The police were closing in, but she wasn't sure whether they were being rescued or set up. Her mind raced, calculating every angle. If they stepped out of the car, they could be detained, arrested, or worse. If they fought, it could escalate in a way they couldn't predict. But staying in the car, was that the smarter move? Or would they be branded as fugitives, hunted more fiercely? "I'm going to take a risk," she said quietly, turning to Kayla. "Get ready." Kayla nodded, her face tight with worry. She knew what Lila was planning. "Officer Hernandez," Lila called, her voice steady. "I need your help. We're not the criminals here, but we can't let Bennett's people track us. He'll kill us if he catches us. So, unless you want to explain this to your superiors after they find out about your involvement, we need to get out of here." Hernandez's eyes flickered, just for a moment, but it was enough. He knew she wasn't bluffing. He stepped closer to the car, lowering his voice so only Lila could hear. "I'm not sure I can stop them, but I'll buy you some time. When I say go, you run." Lila held his gaze, trying to decipher his true intentions. "And if they don't listen?" Hernandez glanced over his shoulder, the weight of the decision pressing on him. "Then you better be ready." He stepped back, nodding toward the other officers, his face hardening into a mask of authority once more. Out of the car now. Lila took a deep breath. In that moment, she realized that the world around them was changing, and they were no longer just running from Bennett's men. Now they were running from something far more dangerous, the unseen hands pulling the strings. The tension in the air was suffocating. Every muscle in Lila's body screamed for action, but she knew better than to make the first move. There was a calculated stillness to Hernandez's movements as he walked away from the car, the weight of his unspoken message hanging between them. Lila's pulse thrummed in her ears. They were running out of options. If she didn't act now, they'd be sitting ducks. Nick's voice broke through the silence. "Kayla, you stay close. Don't make a sound until I say." Kayla's breath hitched in her chest. Lila didn't look at her, but she could feel the fear in her body language. No one was comfortable with this, least of all her. But there was no time to waste on uncertainty. They had to get out of here. Lila glanced over at Hernandez, who had taken up position behind the first police cruiser, subtly blocking their view from the other officers. It was a small gesture, but it bought them just enough time. "Now," Lila whispered. Nick didn't hesitate. In one swift motion, he threw the car door open, forcing it wide against the police vehicle beside them. The action was quick enough to draw the officers' attention, just for a moment. But in that instant, the three of them bolted. Lila's heart pounded in her throat as she pushed herself out of the car, her legs moving before her brain had even processed the shift. She heard the shouts, the rush of footsteps behind her, but she didn't look back. The alley ahead was their only hope, a dark path that wound between two tall buildings. It was narrow, concealed, and offered the slightest chance of slipping away from the swarm of officers that would soon descend on them. Nick and Kayla were right behind her, and she heard the unmistakable sound of sirens wailing louder in the distance. But Lila wasn't concerned with the sound of the police chase. She was focused on Hernandez, who had given them this opening. He might be their only chance to escape, and his risk would be meaningless if they didn't use it. The alley was close enough now. Lila reached the entrance of the alley first, her breath coming fast and shallow. She didn't waste a moment before darting into its shadowed passageway, the air growing thicker with each step. Nick came next, glancing back only once, his eyes scanning the street for any sign of pursuit. His body was poised, every step deliberate. He was calculating every angle, just as she was. Kayla was the last to enter the alley, her footsteps quieter but no less determined. She cast one final, fearful look toward the street, but the crowd of officers was still reeling from their sudden escape. They had made it, for now, but the distance they'd gained was hardly enough. They were out of sight, but not out of danger. Lila didn't stop moving as they reached the halfway point of the alley. It was too open here, too vulnerable. The buildings on either side were squat and uninviting, and the further they went in, the darker it got. The shadows stretched longer, swallowing their figures whole. Nick spoke first, his voice barely a whisper in the oppressive quiet. "We need to get to higher ground. We can't stay here." Lila nodded. There's an old fire escape on the next building. We take it and move fast. No time for hesitation. They continued at a brisk pace, Lila in the lead. She kept her eyes trained on the alley's exit, as if expecting an ambush at any moment. The only sound now was the soft echo of their shoes on the cracked pavement beneath them. As they neared the fire escape, the metal ladder loomed ahead, rusted and creaking in the faint breeze. Lila reached for it first, gripping the cold iron bars tightly before pulling herself upward. The rungs were worn, but they held firm beneath her feet. Behind her, Kayla followed next, her breathing shallow but steady. Nick was close behind, scanning their surroundings for any signs of movement. When they reached the top, Lila took a moment to peer over the edge of the building. Her eyes scanned the street below, watching the traffic stop and start as officers poured out of their vehicles, searching for them. "Nothing," she murmured. "We have a few minutes." Nick exhaled sharply, then looked at Lila, his expression hardening with resolve. "Now we make our next move." Kayla shivered, still processing the rush of adrenaline from the narrow escape. "Where do we go from here?" Lila's gaze shifted to the distant horizon. The city stretched out before them, vast and indifferent. They could go anywhere, but every choice carried a price. They needed to find answers. Answers about Bennett, about the people who were pulling the strings from behind the scenes. "To the warehouse," Lila said. "We need to find out what they know before they get to us." Nick nodded. "You sure? That place is crawling with Bennett's men. It's a risk." "I know," Lila replied, "but it's the only lead we have. If we can find the evidence we need, we can turn the tables. We can make this ours." Her words rang in the stillness of the night, and as they looked toward the warehouse district, a new sense of determination settled over them. They didn't have much time, but they did have a chance, and they weren't going to waste it. With one last glance toward the street below, Lila took a deep breath. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was war, and she was ready to fight. The chill of the night air bit at their skin as Lila, Nick, and Kayla descended from the fire escape. They moved in swift, fluid motions, shadows blending with the darkened corners of the city. Their destination was the old warehouse district, a place steeped in history, where memories of deals made in smoke-filled rooms and whispers in the dark still lingered. They had no illusions about the danger. This wasn't just any warehouse. It was the hub of Bennett's operations, a place where dirty money exchanged hands and power played out in secretive corners. It was a fortress, and it would be crawling with people who would kill to keep their operations hidden. Nick led the way, his eyes scanning every corner, every alley as they passed. His instincts were sharp, and his movements smooth, a reminder of his military training. Kayla trailed close behind, a few steps ahead of Lila. Though fear still gripped her heart, she was steady, focused. There was no turning back now. The streets grew quieter as they neared the warehouse. The roar of traffic from the main roads faded, replaced by the distant hum of machinery and the occasional clink of metal. It was a sound Lila recognized. This was the heartbeat of the underworld, the place where everything could change if they could just get inside. "There's a security guard near the back entrance," Nick whispered, his voice barely audible. "He won't be much of a problem, but we need to move fast." Lila nodded. "We've done this before. Stick to the plan." They reached the back of the warehouse, crouching in the shadows behind a rusted fence. Nick approached the guard with stealth, moving like a predator. Lila and Kayla stayed low, hearts racing. They could see the faint outline of the guard, pacing in the glow of the dim streetlights, oblivious to the danger lurking just behind him. Nick was quick, almost too quick to follow. He moved in from the side, his hand gripping the guard's collar and pulling him into the shadows before he could react. A muffled grunt, a shift in weight, and then the guard was down, unconscious and slumped against the wall. Lila exhaled, her pulse still thrumming in her throat. "Let's go." The door to the warehouse was rusted but solid, the heavy metal handle cold beneath her hand. With a soft twist, it creaked open. They slipped inside, and the darkness seemed to consume them immediately. The smell of oil and stale air hit them, the sound of distant voices echoing through the cavernous space. The inside was a maze of steel crates and industrial machinery. Tall shelves, piled high with unsorted goods, cast long shadows across the floor. It was like a city within a city, claustrophobic, dangerous, and teeming with secrets. Lila's eyes adjusted quickly, her senses heightened. She scanned the shadows, the corners, each space where something, or someone, might be lurking. The vast emptiness of the warehouse amplified the sound of their footsteps, but there was no time to worry about being heard. "Where do we start?" Kayla asked, her voice barely a whisper. Lila motioned toward a steel staircase in the distance. "The office. That's where they'll keep the records. The stuff we need to prove Bennett's involvement. We get in, grab what we can, and get out." Nick nodded, his eyes cold with resolve. "Let's move." They crept forward, staying close to the walls, avoiding the light. Every sound was amplified, footsteps echoing too loud, the clink of metal carrying unervingly far. As they neared the office, Lila's gut twisted. They were close now, and she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. At the office door, Lila hesitated. The lock was simple, and she could break it with a flick of her wrist. But they didn't know how many people were inside. Bennett had eyes everywhere. Even here, in this empty-seeming industrial wasteland, he could be watching. Nick pulled out a small tool from his pocket, his fingers deftly working on the lock. Lila's eyes darted around, checking their surroundings, while Kayla stood with her back pressed to the wall, her breath steady but her body coiled with tension. The lock clicked open. "On three," Nick whispered. "1, 2, 3. The door swung open. They slipped inside, moving quickly, shutting the door behind them without a sound. Inside, the office was small, cluttered with papers and monitors, the air stale with the smell of old coffee and dust. Lila immediately made for the desk, her eyes scanning the piles of paperwork. She didn't have much time. Kayla was already on one of the monitors, her fingers flying across the keyboard, hacking into the system with practiced ease. "There," she muttered. "I'm in." Lila dug through the papers, finding nothing of immediate use, just invoices and reports that didn't make sense. She needed something bigger, something that would connect the dots, something that would bring Bennett to his knees. Nick paced the small office, keeping his ears alert, ready for any sign that someone might be coming. Then, there it was, a folder tucked behind a stack of old records. Lila opened it quickly, her breath catching as she scanned the contents. This was it. Inside were detailed files, contracts, bank transfers, and hidden meetings. It was a roadmap to everything Bennett had been involved in, the full scope of his operations laid bare. If they could get this to the right people, it would be enough to take him down. She shoved the folder into her bag and nodded to Nick. "Let's go." They moved quickly back toward the exit, the sound of their footsteps mingling with the low hum of machinery around them. The door to the warehouse was only a few yards away, but as they neared it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed from behind them. "Too late," Lila whispered. The door to the warehouse creaked open just as a figure emerged from the shadows, a figure Lila recognized immediately. Hernandez. Lila's heart skipped a beat. Hernandez stood in the doorway, his form silhouetted by the dim light from the outside. His eyes, cold and calculating, locked onto hers, a slow, unsettling smile spreading across his face. "You didn't think it would be that easy, did you?" Hernandez's voice was low, almost amused, as he stepped into the office, blocking their only exit. Nick tensed beside her, his hand hovering over the weapon at his side, but Lila held up a hand, signaling him to stay calm. She wasn't sure how, but something in Hernandez's demeanor made her believe this wasn't just a chance encounter. This had been planned. "You've been tracking us," she said, her voice steady despite the panic starting to creep into her veins. Hernandez's smile only widened. "Did you really think Bennett wouldn't notice someone poking around his business? Or that you wouldn't eventually come here?" Lila's mind raced. Hernandez wasn't just another lackey. He was deep in Bennett's circle. This was the kind of betrayal she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about taking down Bennett anymore. It was about surviving what came next. "We have what we need," Lila said, her voice low but firm, holding his gaze. "You can let us go now, and no one has to get hurt." Hernandez's expression darkened, and for a moment, Lila thought he might actually consider it. But then, the smile was back, sharper, more predatory. That's cute, but you're too deep now. You think I don't know who you are? I know exactly what you're doing, and you won't get out of here with that folder. You're already dead. The words hit like a punch to the gut, but Lila refused to show fear. Kayla had already started moving, inching toward the side of the room where the backup exit might be. But Hernandez was watching them, always watching. Don't try anything funny, he warned, his tone cold. I have people everywhere. You're not escaping. Lila's pulse raced, but she kept her voice even. You can't stop us. You think Bennett's going to protect you when everything comes crashing down? You're expendable to him, just like everyone else. Hernandez stiffened, his eyes narrowing. There was something in Lila's words that seemed to strike a chord. For a brief moment, doubt flickered across his face. Don't mistake me for one of his puppets, Hernandez said, his voice low and dangerous. I have my own plan, and right now, you're in the way of it. Nick's eyes flicked toward Lila, a silent question. They didn't have time to argue, didn't have time to think about the next move. Hernandez was too close, the space too small, and their options were running out fast. Drop it, Hernandez barked, his hand moving to the gun at his hip. The metallic click echoed ominously in the small office. Lila froze, weighing her options. In one swift motion, she could reach for her weapon, but she wasn't sure how many more people Hernandez had waiting outside. The fight wasn't worth it. Not when the lives of everyone she cared about were on the line. Kayla's voice, barely a whisper, broke the silence. There's another way out. Let me go first. Hernandez's attention shifted, just for a moment, toward the sound of Kayla's subtle movement. It was all the distraction they needed. Nick didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, moving faster than Hernandez could react. In one smooth motion, he knocked Hernandez's gun out of his hand and pinned him against the wall, his forearm pressing hard against Hernandez's throat. Lila moved with purpose, grabbing the folder from the desk and shoving it into her bag as Kayla darted toward the back exit. She didn't look back, knowing the only way out was forward. Stay down, Nick growled, his grip tightening. We're not here to kill you, Hernandez, but we will if we have to. Hernandez's eyes were wild, his breath quickening under the pressure. For a moment, he seemed to struggle, as if weighing his options. Then, with a low growl of frustration, he finally relaxed his body, the fight draining out of him. You're making a mistake, he hissed. You think this will be enough? Bennett won't let you walk away. Lila straightened, the folder now safely secured. She looked at Hernandez one last time, the weight of everything that had led them to this moment pressing down on her. Maybe, she said quietly, but we're not walking away alone. Without another word, she turned on her heel and followed Kayla out of the back exit, Nick close behind. The cold night air hit them like a slap, but it was a welcome change from the stifling heat of the warehouse. They didn't stop running. As they turned a corner, Lila glanced back at the warehouse. The shadows loomed like a silent warning behind them. Whatever came next, they couldn't afford to slow down. The game had changed. There was no going back now, and if they wanted to take down Bennett, they'd have to outsmart everyone, including those closest to them. But for now, they had the evidence, and that was enough to keep them going, no matter what came next. The night was quiet, too quiet for Lila's liking. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer than it should have, and the occasional breeze cut through the alleyways with a sharp, unsettling chill. She could feel the weight of the folder tucked against her side, the files inside it heavier than anything she'd ever carried before. These were not just pieces of paper. They were the key to everything, the evidence she needed to bring down Bennett, to stop whatever twisted plans he had in motion. But as they sprinted through the dark streets, she couldn't shake the feeling that their next move might be their last. They had managed to escape the warehouse. For now. But it wouldn't take long for Hernandez, or someone else in Bennett's network, to catch up. They'd be watching, waiting for them to slip up. We need to get to the safe house, Nick said, his voice low and urgent as he glanced over his shoulder. They'll be looking for us, and if we stay out here too long, we'll be sitting ducks. Lila nodded, her breath steady but her mind racing. The safe house was their best shot, but it wasn't perfect. They couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. As much as she hated to admit it, they needed to move fast, and they needed a plan. Kayla, she called out ahead, where the younger woman was leading the way, her movements swift and silent. "Do you have eyes on the car?" Kayla didn't turn around, but her voice came back clear and steady. "It's waiting at the corner, just like we planned. But we need to hurry." Nick quickened his pace, and Lila followed, the cold pavement beneath her feet feeling like a reminder of how high the stakes had become. They couldn't afford to be caught. Not now. As they neared the corner, Lila's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, heart pounding, and saw an unfamiliar number flash across the screen. Her first instinct was to ignore it, but then the thought hit her. What if it was someone inside Bennett's circle? Someone who knew exactly where they were. "Hello?" she answered, trying to keep her voice calm, though her pulse was hammering in her ears. "Don't trust anyone," a gruff voice whispered, the words barely audible. It was familiar, but distorted by some sort of filter. "Not even your own people. Hernandez is a dead man walking. You're the next target. Get out." The line went dead before she could respond. A cold shiver ran down Lila's spine, her grip tightening on her phone. The warning had come too late. They were already in motion. But the timing was too precise, the message too specific for it to be a coincidence. Someone else was in the game, and they were on their side, for now. Who was that? Nick asked, glancing at her as they ducked into the alley leading toward the car. "I don't know," she admitted, her mind racing. "But they know about Hernandez. They know we're being hunted, and they told me to get out." The words hung in the air like an omen. "Doesn't matter," Nick said, his tone resolute. "We keep moving. We've got the evidence, and that's what matters. No one's stopping us now." They reached the car without incident, slipping into the back seat and pulling the doors shut behind them. The engine roared to life, and the car sped off, taking them further away from the danger that had nearly caught up with them.